the birth of the dragon. We are in the heart of ancient China, thousands of years ago. Not in the heat of battles, nor in the splendor of imperial palaces, but much earlier than that. It is the year 2070 before our era, in the vast plains of the Yellow River, where the mist merges with the mountains and the mud nourishes the origin of one of the longest-lasting and most complex civilizations in the world. Here, in this humid and ever-changing land, the story begins. But it does not begin with confirmed facts or exact dates. It begins with myths, with legends that still resonate in the soul of a country that has never forgotten its roots. It begins with the enigmatic figure of Yu the Great, and with the Xia dynasty. It is said that Yu was not simply a king, but a civilizing hero, almost a demigod. A man who did not conquer with the sword, but with the patience of one who observes the course of a river and decides that the war against nature can only be won through wisdom. According to the oldest accounts, Yu was chosen to contain the deadly floods of the Yellow River, an untamable monster that wiped out entire villages without warning. Instead of building dikes as his predecessors had attempted, Yu dug channels, diverted currents, and worked with the water instead of against it. And in that act of mythical engineering, the legitimacy of his power was born. Because in China, from the very beginning, ruling was not a matter of force, but of harmony with the cosmos. He who could tame the elements had the favor of heaven. This story has survived through generations, not in official inscriptions, but in the pulse of oral tradition, in songs, in later chronicles that tried to organize the past like someone drawing constellations on a chaotic sky. Yu the Great became the first emperor according to these accounts, and thus began the so-called Xia dynasty, considered for centuries to be a mere myth, a useful invention to give legitimacy to what would come later. But time, archaeology, and patience have begun to change that perception. For a long time, modern historians doubted the real existence of the Xia dynasty. Its figure floated in an uncomfortable space between legend and history. But in recent decades, excavations in places like Erlitou in Henan province have brought to light complex urban structures, palaces, bronze workshops, organized cemeteries, signs of a hierarchical, possibly centralized society with advanced technical capabilities for its time. This site, dated approximately between the year 1900 and the year 1500 before our era, matches the accounts of the ancients regarding the location and era of the Xia dynasty, although there are no direct inscriptions confirming it. The hypothesis that Erlitou was the heart of the mythical dynasty no longer sounds far-fetched. The civilization that flourished there not only organized space and resources, it also practiced rituals that made one thing very clear. Power was sacred. The elites buried their dead with precious objects, in chambers oriented with cosmic precision, as if death were merely a passage to another form of authority. Bronze, a sacred metal in the ancient Chinese world, began to dominate altars and weapons, announcing the arrival of a more structured, more ceremonial, and also more dangerous era. And while ancient texts refer to the Xia as just and harmonious, the story also holds shadows. It speaks of the last king, Jie, as a tyrant given to excess, cruelty, and corruption. A pattern that will repeat throughout all of imperial Chinese history. The rise of a great leader, followed by an era of splendor, and finally, decline, caused not by external enemies, but by the loss of the ruler's moral virtue. In Chinese thought, power is never eternal. It must be earned, maintained, renewed. When harmony with heaven and with the people is lost, the mandate fades, and another is destined to take it. That idea, so deeply rooted in Chinese culture, originates here. The story of the Xia dynasty is not only about who ruled, but why. Why a person, a family, a city could speak on behalf of the cosmic order. Yu the Great was not merely a hydraulic hero. He was a mediator between the chaos of nature and the stability of civilization. And when his descendants lost that connection, when the throne became a stage for vanity and violence, the dynasty collapsed and the Shang took their place. This transition was not abrupt. According to the stories, the last king of the Xia clung to power even when the signs from heaven, droughts, eclipses, rebellions, announced his fall. But as will happen so many times in the centuries to come, it was the people's discontent that sealed his fate. In an almost ritual cycle, the new Shang ruler, Tang, did not arrive as a usurper, but as one who restores lost balance. Here begins another of the great themes of imperial history. Revolution as a renewal of order, not the destruction of the system. Looking back, what is fascinating is not only the heroic figure of Yu or the ominous shadow of Jie. What is astonishing is how, in these ancient stories, everything that would define China for millennia is already present. The relationship between ruler and cosmos, legitimacy based on virtue, the alternation between splendor and decadence, and a deeply cyclical view of historical time. Nothing is linear. Everything returns. The river you tamed may overflow once more if those who inherit it forget why it was contained in the first place. And yet, amid the mists, the birth of the dragon is not a story of certainties, but of resonances. We do not know if Yu the Great existed exactly as he is told, nor if the Xia were an empire as we understand one today. But we do know that, in the minds of entire generations, they were. And that those stories shaped the way China thought of itself from the very beginning, not as a place, but as a continuity, an eternal mandate that must be earned again and again. That is perhaps the true legacy of the first sovereigns, myth as the backbone of history. And so, leaving behind the land of mist where it all began, we prepare to enter a world where power will no longer be symbolic, but tangible, where blood and bronze will write the next chapters. A world where oracles will speak through bones and sacrifice will become a common currency. The time of the Shang has arrived. Bronze and blood. As the first lights of centralized power began to fade with the final gasps of the Xia dynasty, a new order emerged on the vast plains of the Yellow River. One that was more tangible, more rigid, and darker. A system no longer grounded in myth, but in the palpable control of resources, of thought, and of death itself. The Shang kingdom, also known as Yin in the oldest texts, took shape as a power forged by the hammer, tempered in bronze, and affirmed through blood. This was not a mere dynastic transition. It was the birth of a true theocratic civilization, where politics, religion, and war were intertwined like roots, drinking from the same ancestral soil. For centuries, the stories of the Shang dynasty floated in the same mist that surrounded the Xia. They existed in classical texts, in chronicles passed down through generations, but not in concrete archaeological evidence. That changed at the beginning of the 20th century, when the remains of a lost capital were unearthed in the city of Anyang, in Henan province. What appeared there was a world organized with precision and obsession. Palaces, metallurgical workshops, royal cemeteries, and above all, a discovery that would change how we understood China's most remote past: the oracle bones. Thousands of ox scapula and turtle shells, carefully inscribed, deliberately scorched, fractured by ritual fire, read by imperial diviners in search of the will of the gods. In these pieces, for the first time, China recorded its thoughts in writing, its fears, its political routines. There is no poetry or philosophy here, only religious pragmatism. The king asks if the harvest will be good, if the ancestors are pleased, if the army will be victorious. Every act of governance passed through this supernatural filter. Power was not a practical function. It was a liturgical act. The sovereign was not a mere administrator, but a medium between heaven and earth. Shang society was built around this profoundly vertical worldview. At the top stood the king, considered a direct descendant of the founding ancestors, with exclusive access to the highest rituals. Beneath him, a warrior aristocracy supported his rule, enjoying privileges, land, and slaves. Lower down, artisans, especially bronze workers, held an ambiguous status. They were not nobles, but their technical knowledge made them essential. At the bottom were the peasant masses, alongside prisoners of war and slaves, who sustained the weight of the entire structure through their labor. It was an empire no longer symbolic, but physically stratified, brutal in its clarity and with no room for error. Bronze, the absolute protagonist of this era, was not simply a useful material. It was imbued with sacred power. Ritual vessels, heavy and decorated with stylized monsters and archaic symbols, were used in sacred banquets to honor ancestors, sacrifice animals, and sometimes people, and seal the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. Bronze was so sacred that many of these vessels were used only once, then buried in royal tombs, as if their mission were to accompany the deceased into the afterlife and protect their eternal status. A fallen warrior was interred with weapons, chariots, and servants. Power continued even in death. These tombs, uncovered by both archaeologists and looters, have revealed not only the Shang's aesthetic sophistication, but also their raw brutality. Royal burial chambers are surrounded by pits containing dozens of sacrificed bodies. Nameless youths, defeated warriors, faceless slaves. Some were buried alive, others ceremonially beheaded. It was the price for maintaining cosmic order. Death as a mechanism of balance, as a tool of continuity. The empire was sacred, and the human body, if not useful in ritual, was expendable matter. Yet this brutality was not arbitrary. It was embedded in a coherent logic within Shang thought. The world was seen as a network of energies that had to remain in harmony. If one element failed, if a sacrifice was missed, if an oracle was misread, the entire system could collapse. The monarch had to act as the great harmonizer, the guardian of the cycle. To govern was to preserve the universe's balance. And it is here that the figure of the Shang King becomes deeply ambiguous. Some were remembered as wise, effective mediators between heaven and their people. Others, like the infamous Di Xin, the last Shang King, went down in history as depraved monsters, more interested in pleasure, cruelty, and extreme divination than in good governance. In his court, rituals bordered on delirium, entire lakes filled with wine, forests of hanging meat, fire dances in honor of gods that seemed to feed on his sadism. According to the later Zhou dynasty accounts, it was his corruption that sealed the regime's downfall. But it is worth pausing here, because these accounts come from the victors, and like all history written by those who seize power, they are tinged with propaganda. To justify their rebellion against the Shang, the Zhou needed to portray the last king as a soulless tyrant, someone who had broken the bond with heaven. Only then could they present their coup as a legitimate act, as the restoration of sacred order. This narrative would later become the seed of a central idea, the mandate of heaven, that invisible force that grants and revokes the right to rule. The fall of the Shang, then, was not seen as a mere military defeat. It was interpreted as a divine sign, a cosmic manifestation that the dynasty's time had ended. And when the Zhou triumphed at the Battle of Muye, they did not merely win a throne. They gained the power to rewrite history. What might elsewhere be understood as a change of regime became, in this context, a ritual of renewal, a reaffirmation of universal order. The Shang shifted from legitimate rulers to symbols of excess, deviation, and deserved punishment. And yet, despite that later judgment, The truth is that the Shang dynasty was one of the foundational pillars of Chinese identity. They consolidated a religious worldview, a rigid social structure, advanced technology, and an aesthetic that would influence centuries of artistic production. Their rituals set the tone for imperial ceremony over millennia. Even their obsession with writing, still rudimentary in the oracle bones, laid the foundations for a system that would evolve but never be broken. As we leave this era behind, it becomes clear that the Shang did not merely inherit a civilization. They structured it so forcefully that its echo still resonates in modern times. The throne was no longer just a seat. It was an altar. The sovereign was no longer just a leader. He was an intermediary between worlds. And history was no longer a sequence of events. It was a cycle, a sacred rhythm repeating itself with different nuances. Now, with the transition to the Zhou dynasty, that cycle becomes even more evident. For if the Shang ruled through ritual and bronze, the Zhou will rule through ideas. The time of the mandate of heaven is approaching, of morality as supreme law, and of a new way to legitimize power. The story of China is about to enter a new era. Celestial Mandate. The fall of the Shang left an open wound in the political and spiritual landscape of ancient China. The oracle bones had been shattered, the royal temples looted, and the last king of a dynasty once believed to be blessed by the ancestors and feared by mortals was executed like a common criminal. The void left by his death was not merely a change of name on the throne, but an existential dilemma. How could the rise of a new ruling house be justified without shaking the very foundations of the cosmos? How could the legitimacy of a lineage that dared to replace the sons of heaven be established? It was then that the Zhou, the victors, articulated one of the most powerful and enduring ideas in all of Chinese political history: the mandate of heaven. This concept, more than a justification for the moment, was a theoretical tool of millennia-long reach, a worldview that would shape the legitimacy of power in China for over 2,000 years. The idea was as elegant as it was dangerous. It declared that heaven, understood not as a god with a human form, but as a supreme, impersonal moral force, granted its favor to those who governed with justice, wisdom, and virtue. But that favor was not eternal. If a ruler became corrupt, oppressed the people, or acted with arrogance, heaven could withdraw its blessing, triggering natural disasters, internal rebellions, or military defeats. When that happened, the people not only had the right, but the duty to overthrow the tyrant and restore order to the world. Thus, revolution became restoration. Coup d'etat was transfigured into sacred mandate. War ceased to be a mere clash of ambitions and became the manifestation of celestial judgment. This cyclical, deeply moral logic permeated all later political thought, transforming the emperor into a figure both all-powerful and fragile. For above him would always loom heaven, watchful, silent, and merciless. The Zhou dynasty, which seized control around 1050 before Common Era, was no improvised power. They came from the west, from the region of Shanxi, where they had prospered as a tribal clan with their own structures, a different religious vision, and a more pragmatic outlook than the Shang theocracy. Their first great leader, King Wen, sowed the seeds of change, but it was his son, King Wu, who led the final offensive against the Shang. The Battle of Muye, with tens of thousands of soldiers and war chariots over the northern Chinese mud, marked the beginning of a new era. But the true transformation came after the military victory, when the new regime had to reorganize the country and establish its own legitimacy. The Zhou administration partially adopted the Shang structure. They did not destroy everything, but instead repurposed what was useful. However, they introduced a key innovation: feudalism. Instead of directly governing all conquered territory, the Zhou king divided the land among relatives, allies, and loyal nobles, establishing a system of vassalage based on oaths, regular offerings, and loyalty to a central figure, the king of all under heaven. Each regional lord had autonomy over his domain, but was required to obey the monarch, pay tribute, and send troops in times of war. This model allowed effective control over a much larger territory than any previous dynasty had managed to unify. However, the feudal system had an obvious Achilles heel. Over time, the vassal families grew stronger, established their own armies, accumulated wealth, and began to act like independent monarchs. The initial cohesion gradually eroded with each generation, and since Zhou royal power was passed down through a direct line, it often ended up in the hands of young, inexperienced, or easily manipulated heirs. What had once been a strong network began to crack at its nodes. This weakening became even more dramatic after the capital was moved from Haojing to Luoyang, following barbarian invasions from the west that threatened the court's security. Thus began the phase known as the Eastern Zhou, an era marked by the progressive collapse of central authority. The king was still revered as a symbol, but his real power extended little beyond his own city. Meanwhile, the feudal lords competed fiercely for influence, land, and prestige. Fragmentation had begun. Yet even amid this growing disorder, the notion of the mandate of heaven was not lost. On the contrary, it was constantly invoked. Every conflict was justified as a moral dispute, every change of power as a cosmic adjustment. Even when the Zhou authority had become purely ceremonial, the most ambitious states claimed that by acting righteously, they were the true heirs of the mandate. Political struggle became a battle of legitimacies, and this tension, this conflict between what one was and what one claimed to be, was the seed of one of the most fascinating and dangerous periods in Chinese history, the Warring States era. But before we reach that stage, it is worth considering what the Zhou did manage to consolidate despite the ensuing chaos. Their ritual system, deeply influenced by the idea of cosmic balance, became the model for all future courts. The figure of the emperor as an intermediary between heaven and earth was firmly established, and their political cosmology, the belief that power must be exercised with virtue and that its loss signaled a universal imbalance, became the cornerstone of Chinese imperial culture. Curiously, this vision did not promote eternal stability, but rather constant vigilance. The ruler was expected to govern with reverent fear, knowing that at any moment his power could become illegitimate if he betrayed heaven's trust. This structural insecurity did not weaken the system, it made it more dynamic. China became a civilization that accepted the possibility of change not as trauma, but as part of its vital cycle. And the mandate of heaven, far from being a static doctrine, was reinterpreted again and again, adapting to new times, new dynasties, new crises. It is difficult to find another political concept in human history that has endured with such strength and flexibility. From the Zhou to the last Qing emperors, every regime that ruled China sought to anchor its legitimacy in this idea. Even when foreign invaders arrived, such as the Mongols or the Manchus, their first act was to claim that heaven had chosen them to restore order. It was not necessary to be born Chinese to be emperor of China. It was enough to convince the people, and the gods, that balance was on their side. The legacy of the Zhou, then, does not lie in their conquests or their art. It lies in having transformed the violence of power into a ritualized morality, in having turned political necessity into a symbolic architecture that would survive their own ruins, and in having created an idea so powerful that it would endure not only the passage of time, but betrayal, chaos, and blood. As the centuries advance and Zhou authority fades, the regions begin to shift like tectonic plates beneath the surface. Balance is no longer enough. What now prevails is force, cunning, and prolonged war. The mandate still echoes, but the tone has changed. Harmony gives way to strategy. The time of philosophers, generals, and clashing kingdoms is about to begin. The Warring States. The echo of the mandate of heaven still resonated in the collective consciousness, but the harmony it had once promised was now a distant memory. The land had shattered like a jade vase smashed against the ground, and each fragment now claimed the right to be the whole. The Warring States did not emerge in a single day, nor through a sudden rupture, but as a natural extension of the Zhou dynasty's gradual decline. The feudal lords who had once sworn loyalty to the king began acting on their own, raising armies, forging short-lived alliances, amassing power, until the title of Son of Heaven became a hollow figure, a ceremonial shadow unable to control the chaos surrounding him. And thus, without grand proclamations or dramatic regime changes, China entered one of the most fascinating, intense, and brutal periods in its history. We find ourselves between the 5th and 3rd centuries before Common Era. What was once a unified empire had become a mosaic of competing kingdoms: Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Qi, Yan, and Qin. 7 great states locked in a constant dance of war, espionage, betrayal, and internal reform. Each had its own administrative system, military style, and regional culture. The political map shifted constantly, like a board where the pieces never stopped moving. Each move potentially meant the expansion of a frontier or the total collapse of an ancestral bloodline. War became the common language, not as a sporadic act, but as the axis around which all public life revolved. Armies became professionalized, arsenals multiplied, city walls grew taller, and peasants were conscripted at increasingly younger ages. The battlefield was not a distant stage, but part of the everyday landscape. The population lived to the rhythm of war drums, caught between seasonal campaigns, forced recruitment, and strategies calculated with the cold precision of a mathematician. Generals gained near philosophical importance, and some would leave such a lasting mark that their ideas would endure long after the last arrow was fired. Among them, one man would shine with singular brilliance: Sun Tzu. Not as a commander-in-chief or a conqueror of kingdoms, but as the author of a work that would redefine the art of war and be studied centuries later by emperors, samurai, modern politicians, and business leaders alike. The art of war is not a mere tactical manual. It is a psychological and spiritual view of conflict. It teaches that the perfect war is the one that is never fought, that the ideal victory is the one achieved without bloodshed, and that true power lies in knowing the enemy as well as oneself. Sun Tzu did not seek to glorify violence, but to tame it with intelligence. And in the midst of an age of steel and blood, his message was like a compass of clarity in a sea of unbridled ambition. But this period was not fertile only in military terms. Paradoxically, in the midst of so much destruction, one of the richest intellectual eras in all of Chinese history blossomed. The explosion of philosophical schools during the Warring States period was so prolific that later historians dubbed it the era of the 100 schools of thought. Each school proposed a different vision of how society should be organized, how a ruler should act, and what role the individual should play in the cosmos. Confucianism, heir to the thought of Confucius, proposed restoring lost harmony through ethics, respect for hierarchy, and education as the foundation of social order. Confucius was not a revolutionary, but a moral reformer. He believed that China's problem was not a lack of power, but a loss of virtue. His philosophy spread among bureaucrats, scholars, and those who longed for a return to the ritual order of ancient times. At the opposite extreme, Taoism, as taught by Laozi, suggested that the more one tries to control the world, the more disorder it brings. Nature should follow its course without forced intervention. To govern, according to Taoists, was to act without acting, to lead without imposing, to dissolve the ego and let the Tao, the cosmic way, guide society toward balance. A deeply spiritual vision that attracted those disillusioned with the brutality of the visible world and who sought refuge in the contemplation of the invisible. But there were also more pragmatic, even ruthless schools, such as legalism. This current, embodied by thinkers like Han Feizi, rejected moral ideals and dreams of harmony. For legalists, human beings were inherently selfish, and the only way to guarantee order was through strict laws, harsh punishments, and a centralized state that watched over everything. This vision would decisively influence the emergence of the first unified empire, as we will soon see. Far from weakening China, this boiling pot of ideas prepared it for profound transformation. Each kingdom experimented, adjusted its laws, modernized its administration, and developed increasingly lethal military technologies. Iron replaced bronze. The crossbow, more accurate and deadly, revolutionized combat. Fortifications became fully developed walled cities, and espionage networks gained strategic importance. Political advisors were not mere assistants. They were alchemists of war, capable of changing the fate of a nation with a single whispered recommendation to a prince. The figure of the Shi, the wandering knight without noble lineage, became common. These were strategists, philosophers, and advisors who sold their talents to the highest bidder. They belonged to no kingdom, but influenced them all. They traveled between courts with revolutionary ideas, promoting reforms or betrayals according to the political climate. Their influence was such that in some cases, a single Shi could shift the balance of power among entire kingdoms. They embodied social mobility, the triumph of intellect over lineage, in a world where noble blood alone was no longer enough to guarantee power. The warring states were a brilliant paradox. As armies annihilated one another, culture was refined. While blood ran through the fields, poetry bloomed in the courts. As the people suffered the consequences of war, intellectuals wove one of the most complex philosophical networks in human history. China was at war with itself, but that war was also an immense laboratory of ideas, ambitions, and structures. This period would not end quickly. For over 2 centuries, the kingdoms rose and fell, allied and betrayed each other, in a relentless geopolitical game. But among them, one kingdom saw beyond the moment. In the western mountains, in the state of Qin, a new kind of power was taking shape. A power that did not seek to restore ancient harmony or dream of philosophical utopias. Qin wanted to win, at any cost. And it would. But in doing so, it would change history forever. And so, in the final flickers of the 3rd century before Common Era, while the smoldering ruins of the warring states still reek of ash and metal, the figure of a man rises. One who would not settle for ruling a single state. Qin Shi Huang would not be a king. He would be emperor, and his ambition would know no bounds. The first emperor. The world had been a battlefield for so long that no one could remember what it was like to live without the constant threat of iron and fire. The borders of the former kingdoms were marked more by trenches than by agreements, and men were born knowing they would likely die young, under a rain of arrows or in the middle of an ambush. The lands of ancient China had become a dissonant symphony of ambition, betrayal, and overlapping strategies. But on the western edge of the chaos, among austere mountains and disciplined plains, a silent power had learned to observe, to endure, and to prepare. The kingdom of Qin, untouched by the luxury of the eastern courts and hardened by centuries of constant warfare, did not dream of harmony. It dreamed of victory, and it achieved it. He was born as Yingzheng, but he would go down in history as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. His rise was as unstoppable as it was feared. He ruled with an almost supernatural conviction, as if each of his decisions responded to a logic that others had yet to comprehend. He was not merely a king seeking to conquer. He was a man convinced that his destiny was to unify the known world under a single voice, a single law, a single will, his own. And when he finally succeeded, in the year 221 before Common Era, he was not content with being king of Qin. He invented a new title. He called himself Huangdi, a fusion of the ancient legendary sages and the gods. He was the emperor. Qin Shi Huang did not unify China through diplomacy, but with steel. One by one, the other 6 great kingdoms fell to the overwhelming force of his armies, driven by a state apparatus that was efficient, ruthless, and meticulously organized. His strength did not lie solely in military power, but in the administrative vision that sustained it. Each conquest was absorbed into a system that left no room for ambiguity. Feudal structures were abolished, local authorities dismantled, and the entire territory was divided into prefectures directly subordinate to the central government. Power ceased to be a decentralized web of alliances and became a vertical line descending from the emperor to the rest of the nation without interruption. But Qin Shi Huang's true revolution was ideological. He imposed legalism as the only acceptable doctrine. This philosophy, profoundly pragmatic and authoritarian, was rooted in a deep distrust of human nature. It held that people were not naturally virtuous, and that order could not be achieved through education or moral inspiration, but through clear laws, precise rewards, and merciless punishments. According to this logic, the state's duty was not to cultivate conscious citizens, but obedient ones. Any form of thought that diverted individuals from that obedience was a direct threat to the empire's equilibrium, and he acted accordingly. Confucian texts were persecuted. Private libraries were burned. Ancient books deemed to have no immediate technical use were ordered destroyed, and many scholars who resisted this policy were executed or buried alive. This event, remembered as the burning of books and the burying of scholars, marked a point of no return, the birth of the totalitarian state. Information was centralized, written language was standardized, the system of weights and measures was unified, and even the width of wagon wheels was regulated to ensure smooth circulation on the imperial roads, which now stretched like veins of stone across the entire territory. This obsession with control extended even into symbolic dimensions. The emperor became invisible. No artisan was allowed to sculpt his likeness without authorization. Audiences were ceremonies of silence and submission. His voice, his image, his very figure were treated as sacred, untouchable, separated from the rest of humanity. Because Qin Shi Huang did not see himself as part of the people he governed, but as the immovable axis of the universe. A man-turned-institution, cosmic principle, living embodiment of order. Yet within him beat a restlessness that no decree could silence. The fear of death. The emperor who had tamed an entire continent could not accept that his power had such a vulgar limit as human mortality. He surrounded himself with alchemists, physicians, and charlatans who promised the elixir of immortality. He traveled to distant lands in search of magical islands inhabited by eternal sages. He ordered the construction of secret palaces, underground tunnels, and hidden temples in hopes of finding a crack in the natural laws he himself had subdued. The same man who organized the empire with the logic of a perfect machine surrendered, in private, to the oldest delusions of the human soul. And while he sought to escape time, he ordered the construction of his tomb, a mausoleum so colossal, so complex, that it remains shrouded in mystery even today. There, beneath an artificial mountain, he was buried surrounded by an army of terracotta soldiers, thousands of life-sized figures in perfect formation, each with a unique face, each armed and ready to protect him in the afterlife. The floor of the mausoleum, according to ancient chronicles, was covered with rivers of mercury replicating the real courses of the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. Stars painted on the ceiling recreated the night sky. It was, literally, an underground universe. Not a tomb, but a world of his own, sealed, inaccessible, immortal. But fate was cruel to him. He died in the year 210. Before Common Era, during a journey to the east, having never found the secret of eternal life. And although his system had seemed invulnerable, it collapsed quickly. His son, unable to manage internal tensions and lacking the charisma or brutal clarity of his father, failed to maintain order. Rebellion erupted like wildfire. The provinces rose up. Enemies once subdued by fear regained their breath. In less than a decade, the Qin dynasty had fallen. And yet, something of him endured. Qin Shi Huang disappeared, but the idea of the empire he imposed never faded. He had proven that it was possible to govern all of China from a single center, with uniform laws, a standing army, and a rationalized bureaucracy. He had changed the scale of power. No later ruler would dare return to feudal fragmentation. All of them, in one way or another, would follow his example, even those who criticized his harshness. His legacy was inscribed in maps, in language, in collective consciousness. The dream of a unified empire was no longer a utopia. It was a precedent. And so, when the rebels overthrew the last Qin ruler and chaos once again threatened to consume the nation, a new figure emerged. More flexible, more charismatic, less authoritarian, but equally ambitious. Liu Bang, a man of humble origins, would lead the transition to a new dynasty, one more enduring, wiser in its balances. It was the beginning of the Han, and with them, the empire would become a civilization. The Silk Empire. After the death of the first emperor, the landscape he left behind was that of a monumental structure, but one already riddled with cracks. Powerful in appearance, yet crumbling from within. The regime of Qin Shi Huang, as efficient as it was inflexible, had built an empire based on absolute control, and without him at the helm, that order collapsed with a speed that surprised even those who had resisted it. In that dangerous vacuum, just as it seemed China would once again descend into the cyclical abyss of war and fragmentation, an unexpected figure emerged. A man who descended not from divine bloodlines or aristocratic clans, but from fields and villages. Liu Bang. That peasant, turned rebel, turned strategist, achieved what so many had dreamed of, and so few had managed. He founded a new dynasty, the Han, and with it, ushered in one of the longest-lasting, most stable, and most brilliant periods in all of Chinese history. A time in which the empire not only remained united, but expanded, became more sophisticated, and transformed into a model civilization for future centuries. An era in which silk, knowledge, and diplomacy wove an invisible network that connected the heart of China with the farthest reaches of the known world. The Han dynasty was formally established in the year 206 before Common Era and would last for over 4 centuries, with only a brief interruption in the middle. Its founder, Liu Bang, who would go down in history as Emperor Gaozu, understood the main lesson of the Qin collapse. No empire can be sustained by force alone. Authority must be combined with legitimacy, punishment with reward, law with morality. Instead of continuing with pure legalism, the Han promoted a system that merged the best of several schools of thought. They preserved a strong centralized structure, but softened it with Confucian philosophy, which offered an ethical and humane framework for political action. It was under the Han that Confucianism ceased to be a marginal school and became the official doctrine of the state. The teachings of Confucius, once considered subversive during the Qin era, now became mandatory foundations for training public officials. An imperial examination system was created, rewarding merit and knowledge, thereby laying the groundwork for a literate bureaucracy that would, in time, become more powerful than many noble lineages. To govern under the Han meant knowing the classics, interpreting the rites, acting with righteousness, and above all, understanding that public service was a way to harmonize with the cosmos. But harmony did not mean passivity. Under the leadership of decisive emperors like Han Wudi, the martial emperor, the empire expanded its borders to the north, south, and west. It was he who realized that isolation was an illusion, and that in order to maintain internal stability, It was necessary to project power outward. The military campaigns against the Xiongnu, confederations of nomadic tribes who harassed northern China, marked a phase of heavy investment in both defense and diplomacy. Fortresses were reinforced. Strategic alliances with neighboring tribes were forged, and missions were launched that extended far beyond mere military objectives. It was during this time that one of the most iconic pathways in world history opened, the Silk Road. A network of trade corridors, caravan routes, mountain passes, and intermediary cities that, beginning at the imperial capital of Chang'an, crossed deserts, valleys, and mountain ranges to connect with Central Asia, Persia, the Hellenistic world, and even, indirectly, with Rome. Through these routes, not only goods traveled, but also ideas, religions, technologies, customs, diseases, rumors, and countless stories that wove an invisible web of cultural interdependence. Silk, of course, was the star commodity. Light, strong, and lustrous, it was seen as an exotic luxury in the West. So prized that Roman elites were publicly criticized for embracing it, with some accusing the Chinese of weakening Roman morals with soft fabrics and seductive colors. But in the other direction, China also imported goods and knowledge. New medical techniques, irrigation systems, music from Central Asia, and even religious figures that would later gain prominence, like Buddhism. The Han capital, Chang'an, was a true epicenter of diversity. Cosmopolitan, planned, and grand, it boasted markets where Sogdian merchants mingled with Parthian ambassadors, Ganges interpreters, and Chinese bureaucrats. There not only was commerce conducted, there was spying, negotiating, singing in strange dialects, and discussions about the world beyond the walls. It was an imperial city, but also a crossroads, a window that shattered the myth of an isolated China. And although the state maintained strict control over foreign trade and contact, curiosity often proved stronger than censorship. Yet the brilliance of the Han was not just outward. Within the empire, agriculture was strengthened through technical innovations. Vast hydraulic works were developed, and the state invested in infrastructure to improve administration and transportation. Legal codification advanced, astronomy was refined, and celestial cycles were meticulously recorded, because good governance also meant understanding the rhythms of the universe. Medicine was systematized into treatises, and history was elevated to the status of dynastic duty. For the first time, the past was recorded in an organized manner as part of the present, and that became a tool of governance. But no empire remains free from tension. Beneath the surface of prosperity, internal struggles persisted. The imperial family frequently clashed with the powerful class of palace eunuchs, who exerted political influence from the shadows. The landowning aristocracy grew, burdening peasants with excessive taxes. Local rebellions, though sporadic, were clear signals of rising discontent. Even the balance between idealized Confucianism and the machinery of the state was often broken. Many officials preached virtue and harmony, but acted out of corruption or ambition. Still, the Han endured for generations, and they did so because their model of power blended tradition with flexibility. They knew how to adapt. They absorbed foreign ideas, integrated distant regions, and built an identity broad enough to include millions of people within a single political structure. The Han Empire was much more than a continuation of the Qin legacy. It was a reinvention. Where Qin imposed order through fear, Han built unity through structure. Where Qin destroyed plural thought, Han domesticated it and turned it into a tool of legitimacy. And where Qin sought to dominate the present, the Han began to think about the future. By the end of the period, however, the fractures became more and more visible. Accumulated tensions, succession errors, the rise of powerful family clans, and growing peasant discontent opened the door to a phase of turbulence. Yet even when the dynasty fell, after a brief interlude with the usurper Wang Mang and the later restoration of the Eastern Han, the memory of this era remained etched in collective consciousness as an ideal. So much so that even today, 2,000 years later, many Chinese still call themselves the Han people. Because the Silk Empire was not just a historical period, it was a model, a horizon of greatness that combined military power, cultural sophistication, and openness to the world. With its legacy, China's history did not come to a halt. It branched out, diversified, and prepared for new challenges. For after the silk came the shadows. And the Imperial dragon, after having reached the heavens, would have to learn to survive the fall. Intrigue beneath the court. On the surface, the Han Empire still pulsed with the strength of an invincible giant. Its trade routes guarded, its cities vibrant, its bureaucracy refined. But beneath the silk, a knot of silence was being woven, made of hidden ambitions and loyalties that shifted like the course of rivers. In the halls of the Imperial Palace, where incense burned day and night and the throne seemed as stable as the stars, a storm was brewing. The visible splendor of the empire had begun to conceal the poison of decay, not brought about by foreign invasions or immediate economic collapse, but by something subtler and far more difficult to confront: power hidden within power. The Han dynasty had managed to craft an admirable formula, a strong governmental structure legitimized by Confucianism and upheld by a core of cultivated and disciplined officials. But at the heart of this system, in the highest levels of the court, a phenomenon was beginning to emerge that no moral doctrine or well-written law could contain: the politicization of the imperial family and the rise of eunuchs as central political players. Starting in the 1st century before Common Era, the palace walls became less permeable to formal institutions and more receptive to private conspiracies. The emperor's decisions ceased to be the result of administrative logic and increasingly depended on those who controlled his immediate surroundings. And among all these invisible actors, the eunuchs proved the most decisive. Castrated in their youth, trained in the strictest protocol, disconnected from bloodlines and the risks of hereditary ambition, eunuchs had no families of their own and no visible dynastic aspirations. But that very condition made them ideal caretakers for emperors in their childhood, attendants in adolescence, and protectors in maturity. They became guardians, advisors, spies, and eventually actual administrators of imperial power. They alone had unrestricted access to the emperor, even more than official ministers. And that closeness turned them into a force with their own agenda. Younger emperors, named in childhood for dynastic reasons, grew up surrounded by these castrated officials and formed deeper bonds with them than with their own blood relatives. Once on the throne, those personal connections translated into favors, promotions, and privileges. Thus, the eunuchs began to form cliques, small circles of influence within the palace, often in direct competition with the traditional bureaucracy, which clung to Confucianism as a moral shield against courtly manipulation. This conflict between the scholars and the eunuchs would deeply mark the final century of the Han dynasty. In parallel, empresses, concubines, and their family clans also acquired disproportionate influence over politics. Formally limited by their gender in holding public office, the women of the court operated through their sons, brothers, or lovers. An empress dowager could maintain control over the court for decades if she succeeded in placing a young son on the throne and manipulating him from the shadows. In certain periods, maternal clans came to dominate the state so blatantly that military and fiscal decisions were made by uncles, cousins, or royal in-laws without holding any official position in government. In this dense atmosphere of betrayal, secret favors, and family feuds, a peculiar figure emerged: Wang Mang. He was neither a charismatic general nor a rebellious noble, but rather a meticulous and disciplined official who rose step by step within the state apparatus until he became the most influential regent of the time. His family, related by marriage to the imperial line, allowed him to approach the throne as the tutor of a young emperor. But his ambition went far beyond that of a temporary regent. Wang Mang became convinced, or perhaps pretended to believe, that the mandate of heaven had abandoned the Han, and that he, as a radical reformer, was called to restore the original cosmic order. And so he did. In the year 9 CE, Wang Mang officially deposed the Han family and founded a new dynasty, the Qin dynasty. His government was, from the beginning, a bold experiment. He attempted to implement economic and social principles that anticipated modern ideas by centuries: land redistribution, nationalization of monopolies, limits on private property, and price controls. But he did so without real backing, without a social class to support his reforms, and above all, without internal stability. The powerful resisted him. The peasants did not understand his decrees. Famines, floods, and rebellions multiplied. What might have been an institutional revolution ended in a bloody downfall. Wang Mang was killed by an enraged mob that stormed the capital. His body was dismembered and his brief dynasty extinguished. Power formally returned to the Han, but they were no longer the same. Thus began the period known as the Eastern Han, with its capital in Luoyang. The empire attempted to restore order, but the wounds of courtly disorder remained open. The eunuchs, far from disappearing, regained their influence. The Confucian bureaucracy, weakened by decades of exclusion, could no longer exert the same control. And the people, exhausted by taxes, internal wars, and abuse from landlords, began to turn more and more toward dissenting voices. The seeds of rebellion were being sown rapidly. In villages and rural regions, religious and messianic movements grew without restraint. One of them, known as the Yellow Turban Rebellion, would erupt at the end of the 2nd century as a massive uprising, not just against social injustice, but against the very concept of the empire. The rebels invoked a new era, proclaimed the fall of the old order, and organized themselves into egalitarian communities where titles and bloodlines held no value. The court sent troops and crushed the rebellion, but the damage had already been done. The Han dragon, exhausted by decades of internal conspiracies and civil wars, had lost its capacity for regeneration. Regional nobility began to act autonomously. Warlords, former imperial generals now with ambitions of their own, seized entire provinces, raised private armies, and began to ignore the court's commands. China was once again slipping into disintegration. But this time, it was not a fracture between cultures or regions. It was a collapse of the system from its core. The court, the throne, the very symbol of the empire, had ceased to function. Imperial legitimacy had been worn down by intrigue, betrayal, failed reforms, and a perpetual struggle between those who controlled the emperor and those who were consumed by him. And so, without a dramatic fall, without a decisive blow, without a foreign enemy breaching the walls, the great Han dynasty faded away like a lamp deprived of oil. In its place, a new reality emerged, more fragmented, more violent, but also rich in narrative opportunity. The era of the Three Kingdoms, a time in which heroes would be forged among ruins, and history would cease to be a record of the past, to become a living epic. The slow collapse of the dragon. Before the heroes rose from the ashes and the chronicles filled with names immortalized in romance and legend, there was an intermediate period, a prolonged and silent agony that wore down the Han Empire from within. It was not a fall like those often told in history books, swift, tragic, and clear. It was a constant unraveling, a meticulous decay, as if the great dragon that symbolized China had begun to fall asleep, while its body was devoured by the very creatures it had nurtured. What still seemed like a firm structure was, in truth, a cracked shell. And behind the ceremonial polish remained only the remnants of a grandeur that could no longer sustain itself. By the end of the 2nd century, the Eastern Han dynasty was in a state of deep institutional decay. Previous reforms, which had aimed to balance power between the emperor and the nobility, failed to stabilize the system. On the contrary, each attempt to centralize imperial authority provoked an equally forceful reaction from aristocratic clans who dominated the provinces, the farmlands, and most importantly, the loyalties of the people. Added to this structural conflict was the suffocating prominence of the eunuchs, whose influence within the palace was no longer a secret matter but a constant source of resentment among career officials. What was meant to be a government in harmony with heaven had become a war of cliques at the very heart of the empire. Emperor Ling, who reigned for nearly 3 decades, embodied the fragility of this stage. Weak in character, easily manipulated, more interested in pleasures than in matters of state, he delegated essential functions to his favored confidants, most of them eunuchs. These men, in turn, used their closeness to the throne to sell positions, protect corrupt officials, manipulate judicial decisions, and enrich themselves obscenely. The court became a black market of influence, where imperial decrees could be bent for the right price in gold. Meanwhile, in the villages and farmlands that sustained the empire, the tax burden became unbearable. Hunger spread, and the neglect of the state fueled a resentment that extended like an underground fire. It was in this context that the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted, a massive uprising led by Zhang Jue, a healer-turned-prophet who managed to mobilize hundreds of thousands of peasants with a message of cosmic justice and spiritual renewal. His doctrine, based on a popular interpretation of Taoism, spoke of a new cycle, the end of the Han era, and the birth of a fairer world. His followers, dressed in yellow cloths as a symbol of their faith, attacked imperial offices, captured smaller cities, and proclaimed the collapse of the old order. For a brief but intense moment, it seemed that the empire could truly break apart. The government responded with violence and managed to crush the rebellion militarily. But what it could not contain was the psychological effect of that uprising. The illusion of invulnerability had been shattered. The dragon, once sacred, could bleed. And when blood spills, predators approach. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the state began delegating military power to regional generals to suppress the remaining insurgents. But these generals, once armed and legitimized, never returned their troops to the center. They became warlords, masters of private armies, rulers of entire territories. Instead of solving the chaos, the remedy ended up accelerating it. One of the most revealing episodes of this time occurred shortly after the death of Emperor Ling, when a struggle for succession broke out. General Heijin, uncle of the new emperor, tried to purge the eunuchs from the court, but his hasty methods and political clumsiness made him a victim of his own plans. He was assassinated inside the palace, and his death triggered a chain reaction. Another general, Dong Chuo, took advantage of the power vacuum to seize control of the capital, escorted by an intimidating army. He installed a new puppet emperor on the throne and ruled as a dictator, looting the state's reserves, terrorizing the court, and provoking a coalition of regional warlords who rose up against him. What followed was a prolonged civil war, not between 2 defined factions, but among multiple actors who proclaimed themselves defenders of the empire while tearing it apart from within. Provinces became isolated, taxes ceased to reach the capital, and institutions disintegrated one by one. There was no recognized authority, no clear line of succession, no shared idea of the state. Each regional strongman began to act as sovereign in his own territory, appointing officials, minting currency, and building fortresses as if history had regressed by centuries. The imperial unity, which had long been upheld by the inertia of the sacred, now had no one to defend it. Amid this turmoil, some names began to stand out. Yuan Shao, descendant of an aristocratic family. Cao Cao, a brilliant military man of more modest origins. Liu Bei, an apparent distant relative of the Han house who sought to preserve dynastic legitimacy. And Sun Jian, a southern warrior with firm ambitions. None of them could control the entire territory, but all wanted to play the role of savior. Each gathered their own allies, seized strategic cities, and began crafting a narrative to justify their claim. What was at stake was no longer just political power, but the very symbol of what it meant to be emperor. The Han throne, though empty of real power, remained a sacred token that conferred moral authority, and everyone wanted to possess it. The people trapped amid these rivalries suffered without respite. Crops were requisitioned to feed armies. Villages were razed by enemy forces. Forced migrations, famine, disease, and uncertainty caused a demographic collapse in some regions. The very idea of empire began to vanish from the daily experience of millions. What had once been a cohesive civilization fragmented into de facto kingdoms, each with its own laws, rituals, and systems of taxation. The geography of power changed completely. History had entered a new phase, though no one could say exactly when or how it had begun. The collapse of the Han dragon was slow because no single blow was decisive. Every fall was preceded by an illusion of recovery. Every crisis was followed by an attempt at restoration. But in the end, the exhaustion of the system, the accumulated corruption, and the endemic violence brought the cycle to a close. And when the dynasty finally vanished, it did not do so in a glorious final act, but in the silence of a legitimacy no one defended with conviction anymore. From the ruins of that exhausted dynasty, a new era would be born, an age of intense rivalries, fragile alliances, and feats that would become legend. The map would be redrawn into 3 opposing powers, 3 visions of the future, 3 possible paths for a civilization that refused to die. The time of the 3 kingdoms was about to begin, and with it, history would shift from politics to epic. Heroes and demons. The empire was no longer one, nor was its story. In the collective memory, the paths of the imperial past and the turbulent present began to diverge, as if the threads of destiny had chosen to tear themselves apart in order to weave a new web of conflict, ambition, and betrayal. The name of the Han dynasty, which for centuries had served as the axis of legitimacy, now became a floating memory, a convenient excuse for those who sought to claim its prestige, but also a hollow symbol, invoked by many and understood by few. In this land divided by steel, a new generation was emerging, one that did not expect to inherit the world, but to conquer its own. And in that conquest, the line between hero and demon would be blurred forever. The era of the 3 kingdoms did not begin with an official proclamation or a precise date. It was the inevitable outcome of the gradual collapse of central authority and the rise of several regional powers that had survived the fall of the Han. The chaos that had engulfed the imperial court left behind a China divided among 3 charismatic figures. 3 men who, amid the ruins, dared to envision a new unity under their command: Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan. Each with his own virtues, each with his own sins, and each with an army ready to die for him. Official history would portray them as strategists, emperors, or usurpers. But the people would remember them as living archetypes: the fox, the sage, the tiger, men of flesh turned into mythology. Cao Cao, arguably the most complex of the 3, was the first to consolidate a true power structure. Though of relatively humble origin, he possessed a relentless intellect and unmatched political acumen, skillfully navigating the labyrinth of Han decay. He did not seek the imperial title right away. Instead, he ruled in the name of a puppet emperor, maintaining the illusion of continuity, while in reality, it was he who made the laws, led the campaigns, and determined the fate of millions. His base of power was in the north, and from there he built an administrative and military network that rivaled the efficiency of any prior dynasty. He was a ruthless reformer, a patron of literature, and a strategist without scruples. In his mouth, Confucian wisdom could sound like a death sentence. To his enemies, He was a demon disguised as a statesman. To his allies, the last hope of a new order. In contrast, Liu Bei embodied the gentler face of the collapse. He claimed descent from the Han Imperial family, though in practice his lineage was as vague as his origins. A sandal merchant in his youth, he became a charismatic leader who managed to attract men of exceptional talent and loyalty, such as Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, warriors who became legends for their bravery and sense of honor. Liu Bei was neither a brilliant military strategist nor a gifted administrator. His strength lay in personal magnetism and in his ability to embody a moral cause. Where Cao Cao offered order, Liu Bei promised justice. Where one built empires from the mind, the other did so from the heart. His struggle was more symbolic than territorial, a desperate attempt to restore the legitimacy of the Han throne, or at least to preserve its memory against the relentless machinery of a new age. The third, Sun Quan, inherited a power base built by his father and elder brother in the south, a fertile, strategic region relatively distant from the traditional centers of imperial power. He secured his position with pragmatic intelligence and steady diplomacy. Neither as ruthless as Cao Cao, nor as idealistic as Liu Bei, Sun Quan balanced alliances, strengthened his navy, and turned his domain into a stable power. He was the first of the three to build a functional state without hiding behind Han nostalgia. His kingdom of Wu prospered in culture, commerce, and military strength. And although his legacy was less mythologized than his rivals, it endured as a model of balance amid chaos. The tension among these three leaders culminated in one of the most legendary confrontations in Chinese history, the Battle of Red Cliffs in the year 208. There, the southern forces, led by the alliance between Sun Quan and Liu Bei, confronted the colossal army of Cao Cao, who had descended from the north intending to unify the country under his rule. It was a clash not just of soldiers, but of visions. Naval strategies, secret pacts, precisely timed fires, and maneuvers through the mist transformed that confrontation into an epic opera. Cao Cao, defeated, retreated. The south retained its independence, and the tripartite balance was solidified. From then on, the territory was divided into three major blocks: Wei, governed by Cao Cao and his son; Shu, led by Liu Bei and his successors; and Wu, under the rule of Sun Quan. Each kingdom developed its own identity, shaped by history, local culture, and political systems. But none of the three could achieve definitive supremacy. Every attempt at reunification collapsed amid betrayals, costly battles, and endless cycles of conspiracy. For the first time in centuries, China had no center. Power revolved around three poles that repelled and attracted one another without ever merging. This period, although brief in historical terms, barely a few decades, left a massive imprint on Chinese culture. It was the perfect stage for history to merge with fiction. Chroniclers and poets turned the protagonists into near-mythical figures. Military memoirs, war journals, and oral narratives eventually gave rise to the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of the pillars of classical Chinese literature. In it, real events are interwoven with scenes of superhuman loyalty, supernatural strategies, and dialogues that turn leaders into eternal archetypes. The strategist Zhuge Liang, for example, advisor to Liu Bei, was elevated to the level of a demigod of intelligence, able to predict battles, control the wind, and deceive entire armies with his cunning. The era of the Three Kingdoms is more than a historical period. It is a mirror where human passions are reflected in their purest form. There, nobility and betrayal coexist. Ambition and compassion intertwine. Loyalty outlives death, and cruelty destroys without reason. It was a time when ideals clashed with reality, when brotherly oaths were tested against the pragmatism of war, and when every victory tasted of defeat because the price was always the country's fragmentation. When the kingdom of Wei finally absorbed Shu and later fell to the Jin, the cycle of the three kingdoms came to an end, but not its legend. Because empires fall, but stories endure. And in the history of China, few eras have been so revived, reinterpreted, and retold as this one. From rural villages to modern screens, the names of Liu Bei, Cao Cao, Sun Quan, Guan Yu, and Zhuge Liang still echo as if they had never died. After this age of giants ended, China would enter a new process of reunification, but not of restoration. The dream of a unified empire still lingered, but now it had to be reborn from ruins, open wounds, and a country accustomed to conflict. And power, in order to solidify, would now have to face a new division, that of North and South. A new equilibrium, fragile and trembling, was beginning to take shape amid the ashes of the drama. The return of the empire. When the earth finally ceased to tremble under the weight of the endless wars between Wei, Shu, and Wu, and the cries of armies faded slowly like an echo dissolving among empty mountains, the longing for unity began to take shape once more. It was not immediate. Nothing ever was in a civilization that had already learned that greatness did not always come with glory, and that order could arrive hand in hand with melancholy. The era of the three kingdoms left behind a country divided not only by political borders, but also by fractured spirits. The collective trauma of having watched their ancient gods fall, of having witnessed the betrayal of imperial promises, demanded more than a military victory. It required a reconfiguration of the Chinese soul, and in that quiet context, almost unnoticed, the empire returned. The formal reunification took place in the year 280, when the Jin dynasty, heir to the machinery of the Kingdom of Wei, managed to defeat the last remnant of the old order, the Kingdom of Wu. On the surface, history offered a closure. A single emperor once again sat on the throne. The provinces, at least on maps, became part of one political body once more. Rituals were revived, ancestral ceremonies were restored, and the language of harmony returned to imperial inscriptions. But one needed only to look closely to see that what had been restored was not the strength of an empire, but the illusion of its form. The Jin dynasty did not rise from the renewed fervor of a united people, but from the exhaustion of a population that preferred submission to chaos. The Sima family, which led the founding of this new dynasty, had for years been the backbone of the Wei kingdom. With a mix of cunning and patience, its members gradually displaced the heirs of Cao Cao until they claimed the throne in an almost procedural gesture, without great explosions or populist proclamations. But behind that silent transition lay an unsettling truth. The new empire was not unified by conviction, but by fatigue. It was not a flame reignited, but a brazier that remained lit only by inertia. And yet, in the midst of that fragility, the Jin dynasty experienced a moment of hope. During its first decades, efforts were made to reorganize the administration, pacify the most turbulent regions, and stabilize the tribute networks. The elites returned to the palaces, bureaucrats resumed their duties, and the court recovered part of its ceremonial brilliance. But none of that was enough to mend the deeper problem: the imbalance between the center and the periphery. The great aristocratic families, which had survived the chaos of the fragmented kingdoms, continued to control vast swaths of land, private armies, and client networks that rivaled the imperial authority and power. The emperor could issue laws, but in many regions, they were ignored or reinterpreted according to local convenience. And if that were not enough, the court quickly became a nest of internal conflict. The so-called War of the Eight Princes, a succession of fratricidal struggles among the Sima family members for effective control of the throne, tore apart the very heart of the government. Each prince mobilized armies to confront his own relatives, took the capital, deposed officials, executed enemies, and then fell, in turn, to another family member who repeated the cycle. The population, stunned, watched as imperial power destroyed itself without the need for invaders. The return of the empire, which had promised a new era of order, became a spectacle of self-destruction. It was precisely during the stage of internal weakness that massive migrations began from the northern steppes. Peoples such as the Xiongnu, the Jie, the Xianbei, and other groups from the frontier regions, who for centuries had had ambiguous relations with Imperial China, sometimes enemies, other times allies or subjects, began to settle within Jin territory. At first, these migrations were seen as a practical solution. The nomadic peoples offered military services in exchange for land. But the logic that had worked in times of strength now operated in a context of weakness. The newcomers, rather than integrating fully into the imperial system, began to form autonomous enclaves with their own structures, internal loyalties, and increasingly explicit ambitions. The final blow came when these populations took advantage of the collapse of central order to seize power directly. In the year 311, the invaders sacked the capital Luoyang. In 316, they took the second capital, Chang'an. The emperor was captured, the court dissolved. And the north of China, the political and cultural heart of the empire for centuries, was fractured into a series of kingdoms governed by non-Han clans, in a period that would be remembered as the 16 Kingdoms. For many, it was as if the imperial dragon had been swallowed by its own shadow. But the story of China never fully stops. What is lost in one place is reborn in another. While the north was fragmenting, the Han elites who managed to flee south began reorganizing around a new capital in Jiankang, today's Nanjing. There, protected by the Yangtze River and far from the constant invasions of the north, they rebuilt a reduced version of the empire, known as the Eastern Jin dynasty. Although militarily weaker, this southern region preserved cultural continuity, Confucian values, artistic production, and the institutional memory of the past. And from there, little by little, a quiet resistance began to take shape. During this period, China experienced one of its most complex fragmentations. A multicultural north, governed by dynasties of nomadic origin that adapted Chinese structures in their own way to legitimize their rule, and a south with less military might, but which stood as the guardian of the Han legacy, with a cultured elite, deeply ritualistic and convinced of its role as the legitimate heir of civilization. This model of a divided China between north and south, with parallel kingdoms that acknowledged one another and symbolically clashed for cultural legitimacy, would persist for centuries. In many ways, this era laid the groundwork for a much broader China, more plural, and better able to integrate differences. Migration, mixing, and the forced adaptation of traditions produced a more complex, less centralized, and more resilient civilization. Therefore, even though the return of the empire under the Jin may seem in retrospect like a brief illusion, its effect was far more lasting than its emperors could have imagined. Because in that brief reunification, political mechanisms were restored, legal codes transmitted, the Confucian canon protected, and the seeds of future unification attempts were planted. The empire did not return to stay, but it returned to leave a mark, a warning, an inspiration. The next chapter, however, will not come from restorative emperors, but from nomadic peoples who will choose to rule as Chinese. Warriors who will cross the mountains and reshape the identity of the empire with their own hands. The next century will be one of mixing, of confrontations between civilization and frontier, and of new empires that will be born on the margins and sit at the center. The history of China is about to shed its skin once again. Buddhism and Barbarians. On the edges of chaos, where the dust of history had yet to settle, the most unexpected transformations began to emerge. After the definitive fall of the Jin Empire in the north, the idea of China ceased to be a singular throne and a central dynasty. It became an open field of blending, resistance, and rediscovery. The land was fragmented. The imperial dragon seemed to have lost its spine. And yet, in that scattering of powers and cultures, forces began to germinate that would shape a new stage in the Chinese world. Forces that came from far away, beyond the Taklamakan Desert, beyond the mountains of the Hindu Kush, and spoke of renunciation, compassion, and emptiness. Forces that did not wield swords but transformed the soul. Forces like Buddhism. And along with it came the so-called barbarians, nomadic peoples from the north and west who had long been external adversaries of the empire and who now became central protagonists within its own borders. Through wars and alliances, diplomatic marriages and massive migrations, ethnic conflicts and cultural adoptions, these peoples were transformed, and in turn transformed China in deep and lasting ways. During the period known as the Northern and Southern dynasties, which spans roughly the 4th to 6th centuries, the map of Chinese territory became a kind of kaleidoscopic board. In the north, kingdoms founded by non-Han peoples such as the Xianbei, Jie, Qiang, and Xiongnu took control of vast regions. Instead of destroying Chinese culture, they began to absorb it. They dressed in ritual robes, mimicked the hierarchies of the ancient court, studied the Confucian classics, but also preserved their own languages, equestrian customs, and tribal logic. In many ways, they represented a forced hybridization, neither fully Chinese nor completely foreign. Meanwhile, in the south, the Eastern Jin were followed by a series of short-lived but culturally vibrant dynasties: Song, Qi, Liang, Chen, all ruled by Han elites in exile who saw themselves as the legitimate heirs of the classical order. There, in cities like Jiankang, a rich cultural life flourished, marked by refinement, melancholic poetry, landscape painting, and a revival of philosophical schools, now deeply influenced by Buddhist religiosity. For if there was one force capable of crossing all the political, ethnic, and linguistic divisions of this period, it was Buddhism. Having arrived in China centuries earlier via the Silk Road, in the form of sutras and stories translated from Sanskrit and Pali, Buddhism had remained, in its early days, a marginal current, admired by some intellectuals but still far from the heart of power. Now, in this time of uncertainty and mutation, it found the perfect ground for expansion. For Buddhism offered a reading of the world that did not promise political eternity, dynastic legitimacy, or military victory, but rather understanding of suffering, acceptance of impermanence, and personal paths to liberation. The elites of the northern kingdoms, especially during the Northern Wei dynasty, founded by the Xianbei, embraced Buddhism with fervor. They saw in it a tool to unify a diverse population, a philosophical justification for their rule, and a vehicle to transform themselves into sovereigns with deeper legitimacy than mere military conquest. They sponsored the translation of sacred texts, built temples and monasteries, and promoted the emergence of sacred architecture that still overwhelms with its beauty. The best examples are undoubtedly the Yungang and Longmen grottos, true cathedrals carved into rock, where thousands of statues of the Buddha and his disciples, hand-carved over decades, speak to us of a devotion that crossed dynasties, languages, and borders. In those grottos, the visitor could feel small before the immensity of the sacred, but they could also sense the political power that upheld that spirituality. Because the Buddhism of this era was not just a religion, it was an imperial strategy. The monarchs of the north, many of them of non-Han origin, used religious patronage to link themselves to a tradition of moral governance, knowing that the more they resembled the ancient emperors in symbolic behavior, the easier it would be for their subjects to accept their rule. At the same time, Buddhism had a transformative effect on society. It introduced new ethical concepts, such as karma, reincarnation, and universal compassion, that softened the rigidity of legalism or the elitism of traditional Confucianism. It gave a central role to women in religious life, either as nuns or as patrons of temples. And it proposed a much more elaborate vision of death, offering ritual and consolation to a population traumatized by centuries of war. In cemeteries, Inscriptions with images of Amitabha Buddha and prayers for rebirth in the Pure Land began to appear. In homes, incense was burned before small altars, where figures of Guanyin, the Bodhisattva of compassion, became everyday companions. The South, though more resistant at first, was also permeated by this Buddhist wave. There, monks found fertile ground in literary academies, where their subtle rhetoric and metaphors about the mind resonated with poets and philosophers. In the South, Buddhism took on a more aesthetic, contemplative dimension. Treatises emerged combining Taoist thought with Mahayana doctrine, and some monks became public figures who influenced politics and art. The most famous case is that of Hui Yuan, who from the monastery at Mount Lushan wrote texts defending the independence of the clergy from secular power, one of the first debates on the relationship between religion and the state in Chinese history. This period, seemingly chaotic and fragmented, was in fact a stage of astonishing intellectual, religious, and cultural fertility. Because in the absence of a single center, in the dissolution of old parameters, space opened for experimentation. Buddhism adapted to China, and China was transformed through Buddhism. Indigenous schools developed, such as Tiantai and Huayan, and the foundations were laid for what would later become known as Chan, which would flourish in Japan centuries later under the name Zen. What had arrived as a foreign doctrine was now becoming an intimate dimension of the Chinese soul. And yet, despite the richness of this mosaic, the longing for unity remained dormant. The idea that there should be a single emperor, a single throne, a single calendar, never completely vanished. It was there, asleep, like a background melody running through the centuries. The northern courts, increasingly Sinicized, began to imagine themselves as the legitimate heirs of the Han. The southern courts, proud of their cultural continuity, patiently awaited the opportunity to reunite the country under their banner. Buddhism could offer comfort and wisdom, but it could not fully replace the political drive for reunification. And that drive was about to be reawakened. A new dynasty would rise from the ruins of the north with an ambitious vision, a renewed military apparatus, and a will of iron. The Sui dynasty would appear like a lightning bolt, short in duration, but decisive in impact. The dragon, though battered by centuries of division, was beginning to stir. And when it raised its head once more, it would do so with renewed strength. Age of Gold. When the Sui dynasty briefly appeared on the stage of history, it did so like a spark that lit the fuse of a new imperial ambition. Though its reign was short, barely a few decades in formal existence, its legacy proved remarkably long-lasting. It was the Sui who redrew the map, restored central authority, reconnected north and south through the vast Grand Canal, and reminded all of China that splendor was still possible. But it was the Tang dynasty that took that momentum and transformed it into an unparalleled era, a period that history has continued to look upon with reverence. A golden age that marked the highest point of imperial Chinese civilization. The Tang dynasty officially began in the year 618, after the fall of the Sui, and for nearly 3 centuries, it would leave a profound mark, not only on China but across all of Asia. It was not a golden age merely because of cultural or artistic brilliance. It was golden because it integrated military power, economic development, intellectual innovation, and global diplomacy into a state architecture that felt astonishingly modern. Tang China was strong, beautiful, confident, and connected to the world. It was the Middle Kingdom at its fullest expression, and for a time, it seemed invincible. The capital, Chang'an, reborn with new grandeur, was the beating heart of this era. It was not just an imperial city. It was an international metropolis, with wide avenues, organized markets, foreign embassies, and neighborhoods where Persian traders, Japanese envoys, Indian monks, Sogdian merchants, Central Asian physicians, and translators from all over the world lived side by side. The bustle of its streets was not that of an empire shut in on itself, but of a vibrant node in a global exchange network. Multiple languages were spoken, foreign coins circulated, and caravans arrived loaded with jade, spices, fabrics, manuscripts, and knowledge from every corner of the continent. But beyond its wealth and commerce, what made the Tang dynasty truly extraordinary was its ability to absorb and integrate. The imperial court mirrored this sophistication. Emperor Taizong, the second sovereign of the dynasty, and the true architect of the Tang system, understood that ruling such a vast empire required more than strength. It demanded moral legitimacy, administrative efficiency, and strategic openness. He consolidated the imperial examination system, professionalized the bureaucracy, and reduced the arbitrary power of the hereditary nobility. Meritocracy became more than an ideal. It was institutionalized. In the arts, poetry became the highest language of the soul. Poets like Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang Wei were not mere writers. They were sensitive witnesses of their time, capable of capturing the beauty of a snow-covered mountain, the anguish of war, the vertigo of ambition, or the melancholy of imperial decline. Their verses were not courtly embellishments. They were tools for understanding human emotion with precision. Tang poetry transcended genres, social classes, and historical eras. It was memorized in schools, read in taverns, recited in military camps, and engraved on funeral stelae. Through them, the soul of China spoke with its own voice. Painting, music, calligraphy, and ceramics also reached new heights. Pigments were refined, brushstrokes were stylized, new musical instruments were developed, and a freer, less rigid visual language emerged. Female artists began gaining recognition, and at times the court fostered an aesthetic climate more akin to a renaissance than to a traditional dynasty. Fashion, influenced by constant contact with other cultures, incorporated styles, colors, and fabrics from distant lands. Tang ceramic figures, with their rounded shapes and dynamic poses, reflect a world untroubled by austerity and fascinated with the sensuality of life. In religious matters, Buddhism was at its peak. Great monasteries, carved in stone or built with wood and gold, served not only as spiritual centers, but also as economic, academic, and social hubs. Pilgrimage routes were active, and monks traveled to India to retrieve sutras and relics, which were then translated, studied, and spread throughout the empire. Buddhist schools such as Tiantai, Huayan, and the emerging Chan, later known as Zen, flourished, offering increasingly sophisticated interpretations of Shakyamuni's thought. Yet this spiritual expansion coexisted with a remarkable degree of freedom. Taoism remained strong. Confucianism guided state ethics, and other religions, such as Zoroastrianism, Nestorian Christianity, and even Islam, had an official presence within the walls of Chang'an. It was, ultimately, an empire of confidence, so solid in its foundations that it did not fear mixing, opening, absorbing without losing itself. The security of its identity made contact with the other possible, and that openness, far from diluting Chinese culture, strengthened it. The Tang knew that their prestige rested not on isolation, but on refinement, not on rigidity, but on clarity of vision. But as with all moments of absolute splendor, the seeds of decline were already sown. As the dynasty moved into its second half, internal conflicts began to grow. The state, so centralized and effective at the start, fell victim to its own expansion. Regional governments, led by military governors known as jiedushi, gained increasing autonomy. Ongoing military campaigns, especially those against Western peoples, exhausted both resources and the patience of the peasantry. Then came what no Tang emperor had foreseen: the rebellion of Anlushan, a general of Sogdian Turkic origin who had once been a favorite of the throne. In the year 755, With the support of his regional army, An Lushan rose up, marched toward the capital, and forced the court to flee. Though the rebellion was eventually crushed after years of bloody conflict, the empire was never the same again. Trust had been shattered. The economy was devastated. The central army lost influence, and the Jiedushi, far from being purged, consolidated their power and began to behave like feudal lords in their respective regions. From then on, the Tang dynasty entered a long decline, still brilliant artistically, but politically unstable. Internal power struggles, purges, emperors manipulated by cliques, and growing military weakness made the end inevitable. In the year 907, the last Tang emperor was forced to abdicate. The dragon faded without a roar, and the land fragmented once more. Even so, the Tang legacy did not disappear. It was such a rich, sophisticated, and beauty-filled era that it forever shaped the image of what China could become. In later centuries, emperors would try to replicate its system, its aesthetics, its grandeur. Poets would continue to recite its verses, and the world, upon hearing the name Tang, would think of gold, harmony, balance, and splendor. But after every golden age, a test follows. And the coming test would be complex, ambiguous, and filled with tensions. For after cultural brilliance would come the shadows of political manipulation, fanaticism, powerful women, influential monks, and a court worn down by mistrust. The empire was not entirely dead. It was merely preparing to reveal its most intimate face, that of the hidden conflicts behind the curtain of power. Women, monks, and massacres. After the shock caused by the An Lushan rebellion, the Tang court was left marked by a constant tremor, a sense that the world was no longer entirely safe. This sense of insecurity was not confined to the visible. It crept through the corridors, into the halls adorned with silk and gold, where new women began to play a central role. They were not mere decorative figures. Empresses, concubines, and nuns began to shape a parallel power to the throne, and exercised it with decisive influence. But behind their rise loomed deadly shadows, religious persecutions, clandestine seminaries, and ritualized massacres. The splendor of the court was increasingly a mirage, because true power now moved through dark, almost invisible zones, and lethally efficient ones. The most influential figure of this period was undoubtedly Wu Zetian. Under her name, a deep transformation of the imperial system took shape, and behind it unfolded one of the most controversial reigns in all of Chinese history. Originally a concubine, later empress consort, and finally autonomous sovereign, Wang, her maiden surname, rose to power step by step, with razor-sharp political intelligence and an iron will. She capitalized on rivalries between aristocratic clans, where legitimist factions and regional loyalties openly clashed. She supported the eunuchs, protected the Buddhists, and placed intelligent and loyal women in key positions. When she assumed full control in the year 690, she did so with the firm conviction that the world did not need a patriarchal restoration, but rather a more pragmatic and inclusive order based on her own vision. Wu Zetian redesigned the bureaucracy. She promoted merit through reinforced exams, accepted candidates of modest origin, and strengthened secret networks of espionage. But her government also left a trail of blood. Those who stood in her way were accused of treason, exiled, or executed. In her search for enemies, she conspired to create a system of mandatory denunciations that fueled widespread paranoia. Court women who were not loyal vanished in silence. Often, victims included the children of rival concubines or even members of the imperial family deemed a threat. The throne, immunized, remained the epicenter of a court fertile for treachery and fear, and the empress selected burned-out sedition as one would exile demons with fire. As female power consolidated behind the scenes, religious orders enjoyed an unusual presence. Late Buddhism and religious Taoism created circles where spiritual and worldly power intertwined. Temples and monasteries began to accumulate wealth, land, and tax records that escaped the state's direct control. Administrative and even military apparatuses operated from within sacred complexes. This did not go unnoticed by the rulers. While Christianity was viewed with suspicion, growing concerns emerged that these spiritual communities could become centers of resistance or political ambition. The coexistence of influential female power with religious autonomy was fascinating, but explosive. Under the direct influence of Wu Zetian and her successors, there arose zones where repression of religious dissent reached unexpected levels of cruelty. Hundreds of monks and nuns were arrested and tortured. Monastic properties were abruptly confiscated and converted into palaces, arsenals, or administrative buildings. Popular fervor for Buddhism suddenly became a threat to the state's rational order. The imperial hand responded with systematic purges. And though many orders survived, deep collective scars hardened the relationship between politics and religious sanctity. Another confrontation opened between the poor and the bureaucracy. While the court fought for control of historical symbols, spontaneous rebellions arose in remote regions. Peasant sects erupted, driven by apocalyptic calendars, divine visions, and the promise of a land freed from the yoke of the magnates. Some groups proclaimed themselves heirs to the Han past. Others sketched out egalitarian utopias inspired by Buddhist texts. They became targets of recurring repression and manuals of religious extermination. Entire fields were laid waste, villages vanished from maps, and many rebels were forced to witness the destruction of their temples before being executed. This atmosphere of purges made the Tang court less aesthetic and more violent. Its symbols became infused with an air of fear, silence, and surveillance. Intrigues became subtler, but also deadlier. An innocent stroll through the palace halls could be observed and analyzed by eunuchs in a ritual of loyalty or betrayal. A misplaced smile during a ceremony could be interpreted as rebellion. The power structure had begun to resemble the sharp edges seen during the Qin and Han periods: strict rules, extreme punishments, ritual fanaticism. Regarding her potential successors, Wu Zetian established an unprecedented model of power. A bureaucratic structure that did not depend on her status as a woman, but that functioned as an extension of her will. She promoted balance among influential clans, reduced the power of the traditional aristocracy, and elevated the rank of cultivated mandarins. However, this system would abruptly fall into crisis after her death. A period of regression toward the old male and eunuch guard followed, unable to maintain the same level of stability. Within just a few years, internal clashes resurfaced like plates under a thin crust, leading to coups, conspiracies, and betrayals. Even so, despite the return to disputes among men, the women who had gained influence in the court left an inevitable imprint. The female elite was sensitive enough to transform administrative practices, foster literary patronage, protect sacred works, and ensure a cultural presence that would endure in later times. The art and literature created during and after their era retained elements of feminine sensitivity, like invisible threads woven into the web of power. With Wu Zetian expired one of those Tang dynasties that had managed to combine political stature with cultural brilliance. But the cycle of purges would not truly vanish from collective memory. For the generations that followed preserved the image of a determined, feared, and, for many, visionary empress. Female ambition had crossed the threshold of political power without turning back, and its passage, yes, had shattered prior norms, but without erasing the cultural prestige that allowed the Tang court to endure almost a century more before its final fall. This period marked the end of the traditional imperial path. What would come next was an empire complemented by religious and female power, which would change the face of global authority. West and East would converge in the coming centuries toward structures where religion, women, and the state would form a dividing axis from the strictly patriarchal past, where ritual, faith, and courtly resolve would be interlaced hands of power and dominion. Between the mist and the iron. After the final collapse of the Tang, China was not swallowed by darkness, but it no longer shone with the same golden arrogance. Instead, it slid into an era of quiet transformations, where power abandoned imperial theatricality and settled into the meticulous efficiency of bureaucrats, the gears of an expanding economy, and the subtlety of ink on paper. It was the beginning of the Song dynasty, a period where iron was no longer a symbol of war, but of technique, and the mist, a veil concealing both weakness and brilliance. Founded in the year 960, the Song dynasty did not emerge with the roar of conquest, but with a disciplined attempt to reorganize chaos. Zhao Guangyin, a general who knew how to read the moment, rose to the throne not through slaughter, but via a carefully orchestrated coup that crowned him as Emperor Taizu. His idea was simple: to pacify the empire through centralization of power and by placing civil authority above the military. To that end, he promoted a policy that seemed radical for its time. The army had to be subordinate to the scholars. And with that decision, a new kind of machine was set in motion, a state that functioned less like a warrior empire and more like a vast and refined administrative office. The system of imperial examinations, which had already existed under previous dynasties, now reached an unprecedented level of sophistication. It became the primary path to social advancement for those who mastered the Confucian classics, poetry, history, and ritual. The ideal of the scholar official displaced that of the sword-bearing noble, and the emperor became surrounded by thousands of bureaucrats who, rather than impose their will, calculated, projected, and analyzed. This model was not merely theoretical. It was reflected in every aspect of daily life. Cities grew, markets flourished, and for the first time, paper money replaced metallic coins, enabling large-scale trade. Internal routes were refined, canals expanded, and southern ports began to pulse with unknown dynamism. During the Song period, China became the most developed economy in the world. Silk, porcelain, and tea reached remote corners of Asia, while merchant ships sailed from the estuaries of the Yangtze and the Pearl River, loaded with goods that, as they changed hands, generated a network of wealth without precedent. But this prosperity was not simply the fruit of commerce. It was also the result of a fierce cultural impulse. The invention of movable type printing allowed for the multiplication of texts, and with them, education spread beyond the elite. Private academies sprang up throughout the territory, philosophical debates deepened, and thinkers began to reflect on the soul of the nation. It was in this context that Neo-Confucianism emerged, an intellectual synthesis that combined traditional moral order with Buddhist and Taoist elements. Zhu Xi, its most prominent figure, articulated a vision of the universe and the individual that would influence Chinese thought for centuries. In his philosophy, every gesture held cosmic resonance. Study was not merely a means of governance, but a path to spiritual perfection. Meanwhile, art entered one of its most refined ages. Landscape painting reached an unparalleled level of symbolism. Mist-shrouded mountains, solitary rivers, leafless trees facing winter. These were not simple reproductions of nature. They were soul maps, expressions of an intellectual melancholy that ran like an underground current through song scholars. Poetry, for its part, became more introspective, more subtle, more aware of time's passage. And in music, the tones grew slower, more nostalgic, as if the empire sensed that its grandeur had an expiration date. Because if one thing defined the Song dynasty, it was this painful paradox. Being the most advanced civilization in the world economically, culturally, and scientifically, yet living under the constant threat of cruder, simpler, but militarily superior enemies. The northern peoples, the Khitan, the Jurchen, were quick to detect this vulnerability. Where the Song offered treaties, their enemies offered heavy cavalry. Where there were debates and poetry, they brought bows, nomadic tactics, and direct ambition. In the 12th century, the Jurchen invaded the north and forced the Song court to retreat south, inaugurating the era of the Southern Song, with its capital in Hangzhou. And yet, this retreat did not signify cultural defeat. In Hangzhou, sophistication reached its zenith. It was a gardened, refined city, crisscrossed by canals and adorned with pavilions, where the elites devoted themselves to tea, contemplation, and calligraphy scrolls. Yes, there was sorrow over the loss of the ancestral North, but there was also a quiet confidence that the Chinese soul would survive the displacement. From the south, innovation continued, in navigation, engineering, and astronomy. Hydraulic clocks were designed, irrigation systems improved, steel production refined, and even the early rudiments of firearms emerged. All this, however, coexisted with a deep structural fragility. Power was too fragmented. The military remained subordinated to civilians who did not fully grasp the needs of defense, and the frontier provinces became increasingly difficult to control. The Song dynasty had wagered on intellectual talent, on culture, on rational order, but not on the sword. And then, on the horizon, appeared a threat unlike any before. It was not a neighboring kingdom with territorial ambitions. It was a people forged on the steppes, accustomed to cold, to hunger, to emptiness, and to constant war. The Mongols. Led by Genghis Khan and later his descendants, they swept across Asia with almost biological precision, as if history had been preparing them for centuries to play the role of total conquerors. As their hordes expanded, the Song knew a conclusion was approaching. Their world, built on ink, paper, ritual, and beauty, stood no chance against a military machine designed to devastate. But even in that final moment, the Song dynasty never stopped thinking, writing, gazing at the heavens, and asking about the order of things. The last Song emperor, a child, was carried through the mountains as the court fled. He was not protected by hardened soldiers, but by poets, advisors, and calligraphers. And when they were finally overtaken, when there was no more land left to retreat to, resistance became a symbol. The dynasty fell, yes, but it left behind an intangible legacy. The idea that culture can outlast the sword. What would come next was a radical shift. Power would no longer rest in the hands of scholars, but in those of hardened horsemen. The empire would become Mongol. And the history of China, for the first time in its long existence, would be narrated by a foreign voice, mounted on horseback and written in characters that had yet to grasp the full complexity of the classics. Ink, Gunpowder, and Betrayal. During the Yuan dynasty, while Mongol horsemen ruled from Beijing and the imperial court fled southward, something began to shift at the very heart of China, as swift and decisive as a spark catching fire between pages of parchment. Ink, that dark, dense substance used to narrate ideas, weave treaties, record decrees, and preserve knowledge, met its explosively poetic accident in gunpowder. Its violent opposite, its destructive counterpart. It was within this climate of fear of the foreign sword and the desire to reclaim lost sovereignty that the shadows of betrayal and rebirth began to form. An intellectual, military, and political process that would forever alter the map of global power. The Ming dynasty emerged from a statue of paper and ink crafted by fervent scholars and former officials who had spent years reflecting, conspiring, writing in secret, and drawing military and logistical plans while in exile. Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant leader of an anti-hierarchical uprising, was inspired by Confucian morality, but combined those ideas with the rebellious gunpowder of disillusioned monks and warriors, as well as with the discipline fostered by clandestine networks. His rise to power wasn't founded solely on the weapons he had learned to wield among bamboo forests and mountain caves, but also on the precision of the bureaucracy he began building even before reaching Beijing. When he declared the mandate of the Ming in 1368, he did so not only before the diplomatic alphabet and the restored examination system, but also before the cannons that had just begun to scatter their first projectiles. The contrast between ink and gunpowder defined much of the Ming reign. At court, scholars regained their privileged positions, academies were reactivated, and classical literature was re-edited. Confucian texts were meticulously edited, historical accounts were reborn as official records, and strategy treatises emerged in the form of manuals crafted by experts in logic and morality. Meanwhile, in the imperial arsenals, a new form of knowledge was cultivated: the chemistry of war, the casting of cannons, the fabrication of bombs, and the logistics of gunpowder. In the same language, under the same dynasty, lived both the author of an introspective poem and the artilleryman calibrating his shrapnel to defend the Great Wall. Yet this coexistence was riddled with contradictions. The literati bureaucracy valued moderation above all, the moral legitimacy of governance, and the ability to persuade the people. Gunpowder, on the other hand, was a violent, immediate, material language. The generals guarding the borders against the Mongols, the armies defending the coasts and controlling transport canals, began to gain real political power. Military governors ceased to be mere agents of the state and became potential regional warlords. The Ming Empire, born as a nationalist, anti-hierarchical reaction, began to tangle itself in its own contradictions. On the one hand, it leaned on literary tradition to legitimize its rule. On the other, it relied on armed coercion to maintain unity. This tension between ink and gunpowder crystallized in one of the most significant betrayals in imperial history: the rebellion of the eunuchs, backed by military generals. By the mid-15th century, the emperor had become a fragile symbol. The eunuchs closest to him used their proximity to manipulate appointments, open channels of corruption in public service, and form factions that operated like kingdoms within the kingdom. In the countryside, some generals assumed control over entire regions without consulting the central bureaucracy. When these centers of power converged, a silent coup occurred. They conspired to depose the emperor, accusing him of sedition, and installed a younger nephew as a decorative figurehead to maintain the appearance of dynastic continuity while they dictated real policy. The coup that overthrew the the Ming emperor, was subtle, like a poem disguised as an elegy whispering a hidden truth. There was no mass assault on the palace, but a quiet military takeover around the walls, while the eunuchs seduced the imperial guard. Within hours, Beijing was under a new coalition: eunuchs, generals, and monks who had been granted permission to produce gunpowder. The throne remained, but the dynasty did not. The script was distorted, and tradition began to be revised under the blade of power. Ink, strangely, was used by those very conspirators to draft imperial communiques legitimizing the military coup. Thus, internal conflict became institutional betrayal. Weapons triumphed over ideas. Yet betrayal had its limits. When the generals attempted to install their own Mandarin, the academies were shut down, printing presses burned, and the eunuchs were hunted down by the surviving scholars. A textual counter-reformation unfolded. The reborn bureaucracy launched a manhunt for conspirators. The documents written in the wake of the coup were compiled as examples of institutional breakdown. New edicts were drafted prohibiting any simultaneous accumulation of civil and military power. The examination system was reorganized to bar both military officials and eunuchs. As though preparing for a new century of feathers and polychrome brushstrokes, the Confucians were once again idolized, but this time with a vigilant eye toward the deception of the sword. Amid this tension, gunpowder kept evolving. Private arsenals, tasked with keeping regional armies armed, began to develop beyond the reach of central control. In the east, merchants sailing the seas in ships crewed by pirates hired by the same military patrons, brought gunpowder to southern China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. There, Chinese firearms began to influence local wars. Ink, for its part, enabled the spread of technical compendiums on gunpowder, treatises on fire-powered projectiles, texts illuminated with mechanical diagrams. Part of this knowledge leaked into Europe through Portuguese missionaries and cartographers, and began to alter the course of wars in the West. The Ming dynasty was bleeding out its iron secret into distant oceans. The most fascinating aspect of this era is that betrayal, ink, and gunpowder became entangled in a web of global knowledge. While Beijing, Nanjing, and Hangzhou saw conspiracies formed by mixed factions of eunuchs and generals, the ships sailing abroad carried not just silk and porcelain, but also rudimentary portable weapons containing traces of gunpowder. Small cannons, yes, but impressive. It was the first imperial export of modern military knowledge, a scattered seed that would bear lethal fruit in places where fire warfare had never before arrived. By the end of the 16th century, the Ming dynasty faced its final great threat, the Manchu invasion. Led by rulers who had learned both from Confucian culture and military technologies, this elite forged a new art of governance, combining military discipline, Lamaist ritual, and selective cultural tolerance. The academies that had driven the military counter-reformation tried to prepare, but their response was historical in the worst sense. Improvised efforts, plagiarized northern treatises, and late adaptations of European weaponry. In 1644, the city of Beijing fell to the Manchus. Ink, in its traditional form, was defeated by the Manchu sword and their strict ethnic organization. Yet it carried with it an offering. The Manchus adopted the examination system, preserved the Confucian classics, and transformed regional gunpowder into a state doctrine. And thus, the betrayal came full circle. The Ming dynasty fell, but its legacy was inherited by those who had betrayed and conquered it. Ink remained the foundation of legitimacy. Gunpowder, the safeguard of tangible power, and betrayal, the enduring mechanism of institutional transformation. China's history entered a new phase, where the duality between ideas and weapons would no longer be an internal struggle, but a method of governance. The Horsemen of the Apocalypse. With the fall of the Ming dynasty, China seemed to plunge into an abyss, as if the very ground had given way beneath its own foundations. After centuries of tension between ink and iron, a new force emerged from the north, embodying the brutality of the apocalyptic horsemen, the Manchus. They did not come merely to conquer, they came to remake the world. Their advance was relentless, like a silent drumbeat taking over a city without warning. Beijing surrendered in 1644, and with it, a new and unexpected dynasty rose, one that would reshape China in ways still unforeseen. The Manchus came from eastern Inner Mongolia, nomadic peoples who had early on adopted Chinese elements, Confucianism, bureaucracy, agriculture, but who also preserved their warrior identity. Their tribal and military structure, organized under the 8 banners, gave them social and strategic cohesion far beyond what agrarian mandarins in the south could muster. When they launched their offensive, it was with precise military planning and a diversified society, blending the logic of the horsemen with a multi-ethnic state structure that set them apart from any other conqueror. The true power of the new emperors born of this convergence lay in their ability to weave a pact with the very Chinese they had conquered, and with those who had collaborated. They adopted the imperial examination system, retained the civil bureaucracy, protected the classics, and rewarded scholars. They had learned that without cultural legitimacy, there could be no lasting power. At the same time, they implemented a tetrarchic rule. The Manchus controlled the military, imperial armies protected the court, and maintained their own authority, while the Chinese, through examinations, managed the traditional state structure. Thus emerged an institutional duality, a machine of power combining military discipline with cultural prestige, able to govern a vast territory through strategic hybridity. This process was not without violence. The conquest triggered a purge of Ming officials who resisted occupation. Some were executed, others exiled to the south, and many chose to die in acts of symbolic loyalty. The Manchu banner flew over Chinese territories for the first time, bringing with it a new protocol that included bans on traditional northern hairstyles, ethnic tributes, and a gradual fusion of both administrative models. The Manchus, prudent in their conquest, did not destroy the civilization they overtook. They used it. They studied its history, republished it, reinterpreted it in their favor, and their empire flourished. This dual power, however, always lived in tension. Although Chinese mandarins held civil authority, they could not occupy the highest military posts. Only Manchus could command the Imperial Guard and elite armies. Yet to complicate the equation, those same military commands began developing within Chinese structures, as generals married Manchu women or were integrated into the 10-banner system. A hybrid aristocracy began to form. Chinese commanders militarized, mandarins bearing sabers, Chinese horsemen trained in Manchu archery. The empire became layered in cross-obedience, embedded within a single state body, and upheld through marriage alliances, mixed oversight, and blended codes of conduct. In this setting, scholars became cultural judges. Their job was no longer just to serve the state, but to protect the symbolic continuity of Han culture amidst political assimilation. They wrote official history designed to legitimize the conquest. The Great Qing dynasty, heir to universal China, declared commemorative texts. Yet they also produced literature of resistance, chronicles of betrayal, melancholic verses about the loss of the South and the fall of Beijing. This tension became a powerful literary engine, where mourning poetry and narratives of triumph competed to occupy every funerary stele, historical account, or official record. Meanwhile, frontier armies secured international trade routes. The Tea and Horse Road, the connection with Russia in the north, and expeditions to Burma, Vietnam, or the temples of Lhasa. The Manchu horsemen moved the empire into new geographies, and in this military expansion, they introduced technological and tactical innovations. Matchlock rifles were adopted, gunpowder refined, even astrolabes and compasses integrated into the imperial arsenal. The empire became a multinational actor, projecting military power southward and westward, binding interethnic diplomacy with the promise of cultural protection, and overcoming the old Ming flaws, militarily limited, culturally republican, and urban. And yet, the balance was extremely fragile. Over the years, the Manchu population shrank in proportion to the growing Chinese body, and demographic pressure began eroding the caste structure imagined from their foundational myth. Some Manchu lords adopted Chinese customs, abandoned their native language, and were absorbed into a vast administrative culture. Chinese officials, in turn, began calling for reforms that would grant them access to military positions. And amid this contest over symbols, small ethnic revolts emerged, opposing purges, defending Manchu folklore, and aspiring not to be absorbed by the dominant machine. The tension between horsemen and mandarin, between gunpowder and parchment, continued to fuel a complex dynamic. Internationally, the Qing Empire extended its influence into the 19th century, projecting an image of solidity and continuity, the union of Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, and China. But its capacity for adaptation was fading. As they crossed into the 1800s, Western technological onslaughts, the rifle, the gunboat, the unequal treaty, revealed the structural weakness of their model. The Manchu horseman, effective against 16th century deserters, was a useless obstacle before the crescent cannon and the Lee rifle. The horsemen of the apocalypse had domesticated China, but could not integrate the new global order he had helped bring into being. The slow and violent fall of the Qing Empire in 1911 closed the cycle of ethnic conquest begun centuries earlier and opened the foundational question of the 20th century. What remains when the victorious rider no longer exists, and only the writings and the rubble remain? The answer, like a new rider, had already begun to gallop. The Chinese people, riding on ink, science, and the invisible iron of the modern age. The resistance of the South. When the Manchu horses broke through the gates of the Forbidden City and the Qing dynasty took the throne under banners forged in conquest, a shadow of resistance began to take shape south of the Yangtze River. It was not a violent uprising or a celestial war, but a thread of hope woven through peasant communities, displaced scholars, snot-nosed refugees, and a few Ming officials who still held pride in their civilization. That southern region, seemingly calm, became a vast strategic refuge, a bastion where a political, moral, and cultural struggle was born to stand against the idea of a purely Manchu China. It was a silent resistance that kept alive the flame of a centuries-old legacy. When the new Qing authorities arrived in Nanjing and Hangzhou, they aimed to consolidate a government that would integrate Han elites through examinations, civil appointments, and the nominal protection of Confucian customs. But that offer never felt sincere in the southern provinces, which for centuries had been home to vibrant economic, literary, and artistic centers. There, under the humid sun and among green rice paddies, a complex form of opposition took shape. Not just exile or armed rebellion, but a cultural, legal, and symbolic strategy to demonstrate that the Qing Empire was not a heavenly mandate, but rather a historical rupture unlikely to be reversed. In cities like Suzhou, Hangzhou, and Guilin, musicians, poets, and scholars gathered regularly in gardens, private academies, and temples forgotten by the Manchus. Their mission was not violent. It involved compiling, editing, and distributing banned Ming texts, documenting the genealogies of families affected by the conquest, organizing discussion circles on ethics and politics, and promoting commemorative rituals. That resistance of the South took shape through words, shared memory, and the preservation of local practices the Manchus viewed as dangerous due to their unifying potential. Still, the resistance was not passive. In the early 17th century, small rural groups organized volunteer militias known as the Ming Restorers. They were not a conventional army, but rather improvised guerrilla bands that combined ambush tactics with pious morality. They swore to defend the Ming name, not to spread blood feuds. Their successes were limited, but they forced Qing authorities to divert additional military resources to the south, slowing the imperial consolidation. They also used writing to sustain their legitimacy. Former Ming officials who had surrendered to the Hanban administration, a mixed government, compiled documents detailing the abuses, humiliations, and legal violations committed by the new authorities. These chronicles circulated hand-to-hand, in loose sheets and crudely copied manuscripts, spreading like rumors that deeply resonated in the public consciousness. They became an uncomfortable form of press, the ancient equivalent of clandestine opinion columns online, and in their own way, they kept a moral resistance alive. This strategy slowed the Manchu acclimation process in the south. The integration of Qing bureaucracy progressed more slowly in Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Fujian than in other regions. There, imperial knowledge was guarded with care and passed on with intention, from father to son, from teacher to apprentice. This tactic had unexpected consequences. For decades, whenever the emperor needed ideological support to justify new military campaigns, he would turn to southern texts to argue that his rule was a continuation of classical civilization. The South, paradoxically, served as an epistemological archive for the very regime that sought to replace it. Over time, the dynamic shifted. With the pressure of direct military force easing, Qing authorities began to introduce more flexible educational programs, designing regional exams with greater emphasis on local maps, provincial history, and family genealogies, areas in which the South could see itself represented. Some Southerners agreed to serve the regime, even reaching high-ranking positions, but they did so with the implicit mission of teaching where they had not been accepted, loyalty as duty, not as imposition. Their posture resembled that of mandarins in borrowed robes, within imperial walls, but with an invisible tie to their homeland. At the same time, the cultural resistance of the South grew deep roots in daily life. Guardians of Ming-era signboards hid them in rural temples. Secret prayers were spoken in homes during banned festivities, and a subtle ethnic identity coded in the color green took hold. A hue the Manchus did not censor, but which quietly changed in meaning. This was silent transformation, a clan-based insular nation navigating centuries with both resignation and cunning. With the approach of modernity in the late 18th century, Southern schools began producing teachers who advocated reform. They adapted Enlightenment ideas, introduced European concepts of popular sovereignty, political semantics, and the basic rights of the governed. These ideas entered through texts, translated works, or clandestine copies. These Southern thinkers, many of them converted Christians, doctors, or merchants, were the seedbed of the modern idea of nationhood. Their core indignation was not just about subjugation, but about the official self-definition of an empire that excluded them. When internal uprisings broke out, Taiping, Nian, banditry in the Yangtze Delta, the South was the epicenter. The passionate followers of Hong Xiuquan, though messianic, found fertile ground in the South. There, narratives of an ancient heritage, of a legitimate rupture from the status quo, and of a sovereignty that transcended ethnicity and aspired to nationhood were already circulating. Though Taiping ideology eventually diverged from these roots, the insurrection was also an expression of a Southern resistance that could no longer be contained in manuscripts and poetry. It now required blood, trenches, and revolution. Though they were eventually defeated, the Southern leaders did not vanish into the dust. The uprisings made it clear that legitimacy could be built from the South, outside the ethnic axis of the North and the Qing definition. When, at the beginning of the 20th century, reformist and later revolutionary leaders like Sun Yat-sen began articulating national movements, they did so supported by Southern networks that had endured for centuries. The resistance of the South ultimately went viral with a modern idea. There would be no Chinese state without debate, without popular heritage, without secular experience, without local flora. That resistance acted as an emotional reserve. It allowed for the emergence of a mature South, when the Qing could no longer withstand Western and Asian imperialist pressures. The first provincial republics, military bases, revolutionary pacts. It was the citizens of the South who first desired a China forged from below. China would change its historical narrative when that Southern force emerged as an alternative to the Manchu ethno-imperial power. When the last Qing emperor fell in 1911, Southerners did not merely celebrate the end of an empire. They became the architects of a national project. The ink they had copied in secret, the recycled Ming texts, the hidden rituals, and the networks of merchant intellectuals became the foundation stones of a new era. The resistance began as a cultural anecdote. In the end, it was the lever of national transformation. The story of the South is not a counterculture. It is the emotional core of a modern identity built from a silent but unbreakable resistance. And when China moved toward the Republic, it did so by embracing that Southern fiber which from the ruins of empire whispered, "Here lies memory, legitimacy, and future." The return of heaven. When the last Qing emperor abdicated in 1911, a symbolic tremor rippled across all of China. The longest-lasting imperial system in the world had collapsed, along with the mandate of heaven that had legitimized rulers and dynasties for over 2,000 years. But rather than descending into silence, the country felt that heaven had returned to its collective skin, a presence immaterial, subjective, ideological, returning to be rebuilt through modern politics. That heaven, with its promise of justice, order, and national horizon, became the center of a new civilizational project. a popular experience born in the south and spreading throughout the land. This return of heaven was, above all, a narrative process. China had to reinvent itself as a nation, and for that, it needed to rewrite its past, its symbols, and its identity. In the early years of the Republic, historians, poets, and politicians took on the role of new priests of the national tale. They denounced foreign imperialism, swept away the feudal weight of centuries, criticized backward cultural practices, and promoted a narrative of modernity that featured modern priests, the school, civil law, parliament, canons, and emancipated women. But that new heaven wore many faces. Among civil ferment rose provincial warlords who claimed moral authority against Beijing. Some declared that the mandate of heaven had been transferred to the Republic, transforming the imperial idea of legitimacy into a modern notion of popular sovereignty expressed through suffrage. Others argued that without the sacralized symbolism of the emperor, the country would lose its essence and descend into the abyss of anarchy. From such debates emerged the silhouette of Sun Yat-sen, who spoke of the three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, social welfare, as political substitutes for the throne heaven mandate. The provincial and legislative elections of the 1920s and 1930s were fundamental milestones. Still growing a fragile national turf, the ballot boxes became temporary altars, and the ink on ballots sought to replace the royal seal with popular consensus. The press, with electrifying reach, channeled expectations and mobilized wills. It was as if heaven had become democratic, a presence that no longer descended from a throne, but rose from collective will. Yet this transformation was slow, fragmented, and full of contradiction. The Republic coexisted with regional warlords, military coups, and Japanese occupation, yet still aimed to uphold the sacred idea of a national horizon. After the Japanese invasion and the implosion of World War II, the Chinese Civil War erupted between the Kuomintang and the Communists. The residency of the mandate was again at stake. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, marking a new reorganization of symbolic heaven. It was not religious or Confucian, nor did it adopt the European tradition of the liberal nation-state. It was a hybrid attempt, a Marxist-Leninist heaven rooted in the millennial history of the Republic, infused with the discourse of the working people, and founded on the party's capacity to embody the future. The rise of the People's Republic was not a perfect ascent into heaven. There were traumatic collectivizations, ideological campaigns that shook the elites, such as the Cultural Revolution, and individual sacrifices that marked entire lives. Yet beneath its flaws and failures, the regime sought to establish a new political theology. Heaven was no longer a metaphysical mandate, nor an implicit pact between throne and cosmos, but it was a promise: progress, equality, justice, national sovereignty, and collective greatness. The symbols changed as well. The national anthem attributed supreme power to the people, not the emperor. The red flag with stars referred to communism, not the imperial dragon. The calendar, public music, school hymns, statues of Lenin and Mao, and civic monuments replaced royal palaces, Confucian temples, and imperial markers. Still, the longing for heaven's legitimacy endured. The party, aware of the fragility of its authority, imbued every gesture with solemnity, controlled ritualism, historical references, and a future-oriented project. Its nationalism was shaped by the idea that China had to rediscover its splendor from below, rebuild itself, and ultimately ascend beneath a new national heaven. This process was contradictory, brutal, creative, and aspirational. And in today's world, as China positions itself as a global power, that idea echoes once more, that it is possible to build a modern empire, strong, economically and militarily competitive, but still rooted in its past. It does so by reclaiming heaven through different paths. The Republican heaven of the left, the communist heaven of Mao, the pragmatic heaven of Deng, and the nationalist heaven of Xi Jinping are distinct facets of a shared deep desire. That the historic heaven over China may also reside in a present that is hard, often contradictory, but filled with destiny. This return of heaven, both promise and utopia, continues. It is found in every red flag, every educational text, every official speech, every national emblem. It is a reminiscence of a priestly past, complex and full of magical layers, but also a civic and political anchor. For what China has shown the world is that the return of heaven does not mean retreating into the past, but perhaps building a new firmament, populated with meanings of its own, shared narratives, and routes toward a collective future. And that is the final commandment of a cultural project that has withstood profound transformations in order to refound itself beneath the same celestial vault, to look up once more and find there the reason for being Chinese. The Empire of Shadows. When the word empire is spoken, many people envision palaces, marching armies, the beat of war drums, and banners fluttering in the wind. But there exists another form of dominion, equally powerful and far quieter, woven through whispers, secret codes, and networks that operate from the twilight. This is the essence of the Empire of Shadows, the invisible evolution of power in contemporary China, where surveillance, informal influence, and cultural control become the most effective tools for sustaining global leadership, no longer requiring walls or visible armies. Since the late 20th century, China has been weaving this shadowy web, almost unnoticed by most. Alongside its economic strength, creation of new international institutions, and growing presence in global organizations, the country also developed a confidential architecture of soft power. Behind trade deals, infrastructure projects, and public diplomacy emerged parallel channels: discreet funding, ties with political elites in other nations, management of media and global social networks, and the establishment of decision-making centers that evade external oversight. In this way, the traditional empire merged with a vast geography of influence that operates without official borders. This strategy began modestly with cultural exchanges. Institutions dedicated to teaching Chinese language and culture, such as the Confucius Institutes, multiplied across dozens of capitals. At first, they sparked curiosity and reinforced a basic soft power. Calligraphy exhibitions, Mandarin courses, traditional music festivals. But soon these instruments became platforms which, under an educational facade, helped weave ideological influence networks, promoting narratives aligned with the government, building relationships with local scholars, and serving as solid bases for a diaspora that is both controlled and mobilized towards strategic objectives. At the same time, on the margins of the formal state, new mechanisms of dual power emerged. Global Chinese companies, partially state-owned, expanded their presence in strategic sectors: technology, telecommunications, and energy. Projects like the Belt and Road Initiative created an architecture of economic dependence in which governments and elites are connected to a network of financing and infrastructure development. Ports, railways, highways, where material benefits are directly tied to political influence and institutional access. The impact is not limited to investment figures. It relies on a distributed framework of multiple nodes. Ports built by Chinese firms, and later partly operated by them. Airports financed under conditions that allow the installation of surveillance hubs. Intercultural telematic networks that deliver localized media content with editorial lines that soften uncomfortable narratives and promote an image of China as a global engine. To support this system, more discrete operational bases were established. Urban centers housing tens of thousands of Chinese citizens connected to these activities, including undercover diplomats, strategic business people, researchers, journalists, and self-funded academics. They form a subtle force that, through family and academic ties, builds a two-way bridge between their homeland and the countries where they reside. The penetration of the Empire of Shadows is not limited to culture or economy. It also acts upon information. Chinese technology platforms have deployed cyber operations and digital influence campaigns across global networks. Through bots, automated accounts, moderated discussion groups, and funding of friendly media outlets, China has developed the capacity to influence international narratives on sensitive topics: human rights in Xinjiang, the situation in Hong Kong, its role in Africa, or its strategic ascent. This control does not depend on outright censorship abroad, where it cannot apply, but rather on information saturation, on multiplying favorable or simply neutral versions that compete with critical narratives and eventually establish dominant frameworks without requiring explicit coercion. The military dimension of this modern empire also appears, though in a different form. China has built a strategic presence in international waters, constructing artificial islands in the South China Sea, deploying its own satellite networks, increasing naval influence in the Indian Ocean, and drawing closer to key players like Pakistan. Yet this military presence is more pragmatic than imperial. It acts along global communication lines, trade routes, and maritime zones, following a logic that seeks footholds of control without formal declarations of conquest. It is an invisible geostrategic power in service of extended national security. The Empire of Shadows proves most effective where public authority intersects with personal influence. For instance, on university campuses in the Americas or Europe, where Chinese educational institutions have helped regulate academic paths, joint research, scholarships, and publications, but have also provided incentives to avoid certain topics or moderate critical content. The appearance of academic globalization conceals a structure of symbolic control that, with subtlety, redefines the boundaries of what can be discussed. This influence is also reflected in the internal political structures of many governments. Pro-China lobbies do not act as radical visible groups, but rather as multiple agents of economic or cultural cooperation, establishing ties with political parties, municipalities, and investors. Turning a bilateral relationship into a network of economic and institutional sectors shields influence from political swings, because the resulting dependency becomes embedded in institutional branches, not easily severed without high material cost. This empire works because it combines the traditional foundations of empire, state, economy, culture, with a parallel and intangible network, the shadow. A dyad of power divided between official visibility and operational invisibility, both essential and interdependent. Here, cultural projections are spun, narratives of peaceful rise are constructed, international regulations are negotiated, and influence is exercised over legislative, academic, media, and urban stages. All under a canopy that hides less violence than traditional empires, but exerts strategic control and protection. The Empire of Shadows does not demand physical colonies, for now, nor does it require military tribute. It demands influence, access, positioning. It calls for recognition of global leadership and the delegation of symbolic spaces. For its main fuel is narrative, being perceived as part of the center of the world, not its periphery. Its greatest test will be whether it allows a democratic nation to define itself freely in relation to China, without suffering barriers of commercial veto, foreign policy pressure, or cultural exclusion. That conditioning will be the limit faced by this modern, invisible, deep empire, with roots as solid as those of any ancient palace. And though it operates from the shadows, its presence is decisive. Because in a world shaped by diplomacy, economy, technology, and culture, power is no longer governed solely by armies or borders. It is governed through information, personal networks, history, and narrative. And China, accumulating centuries of experience in wielding power through legal, cultural, military, and religious means, now steps into the most modern form of all, the silent yet omnipresent domination of the Empire of Shadows. The Last Dragon. The Last Dragon is not an emperor ruling from a palace, nor a crowned figure bearing a scepter and scrolls under his arm. It is an intangible, diffuse presence that embodies the most recent evolution of millennia of history, symbolism, and power structures. It emerges in complex networks of global infrastructure, in economic rituals measured by digital indicators, in strategic diplomacy, in media narratives, and in technology. It is the contemporary form of the Imperial dragon. Quieter, less visible, yet capable of influencing the course of the world without openly displaying its power. This figure revives the essence of every type of power we have seen throughout Chinese history: legal, cultural, military, religious, economic, and now technological. To understand the Last Dragon, we must start with the terrain from which it arises. A nation that has masterfully alternated between eras of centralization and periods of fragmentation, that has reinvented its authority time and again, and that has risen from its own ruins countless times. The structures of modern Chinese power rest on overlapping layers of control and influence. Economic strength precedes political reorganization, and both are supported by public and private narratives that legitimize progress in national terms. Development, security, collective prosperity. This dragon speaks a language rooted in digital connectivity, industrial might, and an increasingly evident presence in the daily lives of other societies. The central element of this contemporary dragon is technology, a vast matrix that goes beyond telecommunications or electric vehicles, reaching into both military and civilian spheres. It adopts algorithms to govern cities, funds scientific laboratories, and leads research networks that transcend borders. The rollout of 5G was merely the visible tip of an iceberg. Behind it, China has consolidated artificial intelligence for mass surveillance, facial recognition systems, personalized commerce, and platform control. Every camera recording a passerby's face, every app tracking their phone, every algorithm curating social media content is a piece of the shadow empire converging with the sovereign dragon. This structure, cemented in hectares of servers and data centers, projects itself outward through global companies based in Shanghai, Shenzhen, or Hangzhou, with a physical presence in thousands of cities around the world. But technology without narrative lacks symbolic power. In this domain, the modern dragon has reclaimed ancestral elements: moral reasoning, civil identity, and the idea of cultural leadership. New Year celebrations, national anthems, the cult of collective progress, monumental engineering, national scientific projects, space missions, and historical commemorations are all woven into speeches that blend imperial past and global future. If today's emperor no longer sits on a glittering throne, he at least presides over televised ceremonies viewed by billions, delivering rhetoric that is both commanding and maternal. The dragon embraces both ancient iconography and digital symbols. The Great Leap Forward replaced by 5-year plans. The imperial throne swapped for a party headquarters adorned with touchscreens. Another key layer of this state dragon lies within its institutions: the party, the government, the military, and partially state-owned enterprises. Its relationship with citizens differs from that of ancient dynasties, resembling more a comprehensive administration that provides social services, healthcare, security, and education. Yet its foundation is built on centuries of legitimacy derived from results. Each dynasty survived as long as it addressed real problems, ensured cohesion, and maintained public faith in the effective narrative of the mandate of heaven. Today, that narrative projects itself through digital optimization, sustained growth, heightened security, and the affirmation of global leadership amid contemporary world tensions. The dragon, no longer intimidating in physical form, manifests through macroeconomic indicators, innovation rankings, internet traffic, and dominance in value chains. In this context, diplomacy and economics have become central mechanisms of influence. Projects like the Belt and Road Initiative or transnational scientific collaboration exemplify networks that go beyond military merit and create a geopolitics of calculated reciprocities. Every modernized port, every hospital built, every airport upgraded with Chinese technology inscribes a mark on the symbolic international landscape, a presence without a flag but with structural weight. The dragon acts as an architect of interdependence and a promoter of a scenario where speaking of China means thinking of connectivity, innovation, development, and market access. Yet the modern dragon's narrative also includes parameters of internal discipline. Every crisis, every internet regulation, every reform in the education system, and every perceived external threat reinforces its capacity for cultural self-defense. Social networks, open spaces for free conversation in the West, operate under precise boundaries in China, defining which stories are permitted and which are censored. This control is invisible yet effective. It is part of the infrastructure of governability that permeates daily life. From social credit tracking to automatic content censorship on global apps, the dragon keeps its fangs hidden, yet ready to bite if someone crosses imperceptible lines. And what about the military domain? There, the last dragon does not parade endless armies or declare territorial expansions. It operates on a strategic level: development of hypersonic missiles, naval deployment in the Indian Ocean, construction of artificial islands, moves into space territories. It is a power that boasts deterrent capacity, regional pressure, and global presence, without the need for constant military spectacle. Its doctrine rests on the perception that it can control or influence movements without declaring war, merely by positioning itself as a strategic adversary. No longer Mongols on horseback, but collisions of advanced geopolitical systems. But every empire, even one made of silicon and cities, depends on internal legitimacy. The last dragon sustains its power by ensuring social welfare, reducing poverty, promoting narratives of national pride, and safeguarding cultural sovereignty. The pandemic was a clear example. State mobilization, hospitals built in days, and organized society were signals of immediate strength. In response, the narrative of global leadership gained traction. It was the Chinese state's ability to act in critical moments without the need for drum rolls. However, the contemporary dragon faces significant tensions. On one side, it encounters opposition from democratic systems that challenge its censorship models, data control, and foreign influence operations. On the other, it grapples with internal contradictions, regional disparities, rural-urban prosperity gaps, rising expectations from a more informed and connected society, and the challenge of an aging population. Its technological and financial strength depends on its ability to manage these tensions without losing narrative cohesion. The central question for this last dragon is whether it can maintain symbolic authority without resorting to open coercion, and project global leadership without diluting its national identity. Its success will lie in rewriting the idea of imperial power, replacing palace walls with digital networks, imperial decrees with macroeconomic metrics, armies with logistics chains, and religious cults with national pride. In this way, the empire of the dragon will be less visible, but more likely to draw you into the very structure it has architected. Ultimately, the last dragon is a figure composed of data, algorithms, diplomacy, infrastructure, and narrative. It is a hybrid creature, born from the fusion of imperial tradition and technological modernity. And its legacy, if it endures, will be to redefine power in the 21st century as a form of dominance without conquered territories, without crowns or armies, yet capable of shaping destinies. Its roar is not heard like thunder, but it is perceived in every connection, every project, every alliance, and every advancement. And that is the most intense form of the ancient dragon, to reinvent itself without ever disappearing. If you made it this far, You have just traveled through more than 4,000 years of history, condensed into the lens of an empire that never stopped transforming. If you are fascinated by mysteries, eternal civilizations, and the invisible forces that shape our world, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and join us in our next journeys to the past. Share this video if it made you think, because history, when well told, never truly ends. Good night.